Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I moved into that old commercial building at the start of the month. The place had low rent and I needed a space for my small consulting business. On the day I signed the lease, I felt a slight chill in the lobby. I blamed it on the weak heating system and tried not to think about it. I was focused on getting my business off the ground. The location seemed decent. The landlord assured me I would have no problems. I wanted to believe him. The first 2 weeks passed without anything unusual. My office was small, with one window that faced a gloomy alley. The hallway leading to my door was long and narrow. The tiles on the floor looked chipped and faded. The walls had a faint smell of old paint. I spent most of my days typing on my laptop, making calls and trying to establish new contacts. Occasionally, I heard people in the hallway during normal business hours. Sometimes they laughed or spoke on their phones, but everything felt normal then. After 5 p.m., the building emptied out pretty fast. By 6 p.m., I usually heard only a couple of distant footsteps on some other floor. One night, around 7 p.m., I was finishing up a long phone call when I noticed a low murmur outside my door. It sounded like two people whispering, but I couldn't make out words. It stopped as soon as I hung up the phone. At first, I thought it might have been some echo from the floors above. The building had old pipes and vents that carried noise in odd ways. I got up and opened my door. The hallway was dark, with only a small emergency light on one side. I didn't see anyone. I stepped out, listened for a few seconds, and heard nothing. I shrugged it off. The next night, the same thing happened. I was filling out some online forms. At 7:15 p.m., I heard soft voices in the hallway. I couldn't tell if they were male or female. The sound was muffled, like someone speaking through a thick wall. I walked to the door and opened it. Silence again. I turned on the corridor lights. They flickered once, then stabilized. Nobody was there. I walked up and down the corridor. I didn't hear anything else. I went back into my office and locked the door. After that, I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't strong at first, but over time, the feeling grew. Every evening around the same hour, those voices returned. They were never loud, never clear. They just lingered in the background, barely audible. My neck hairs stood on end whenever I heard them. My stomach felt tight. My pulse kicked up a notch, and I found myself staring at the door, waiting for the sound to stop. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. One Friday, I stayed even later than usual. I had a big project deadline coming up. I was alone on my floor. It was around 8 p.m. The lights in the corridor were off, except for the emergency lamp at the far end. I could see the faint glow under my door. Then I heard the voices again. This time, they didn't stop right away. It felt like they were right outside my door, just a few feet away. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I stood up quietly, not wanting to make any noise. I crept to the door and hovered there, listening. I could hear the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. Over that hum, the whispering seemed to continue. It had a strange rhythm, like people talking in short bursts. I couldn't catch any actual words. My throat felt dry. My palms were sweating. I reached for the doorknob, took a breath, and pulled the door open fast. The corridor was empty. The voices vanished. I stepped out and left my door open behind me. The hallway was chilly. The air felt heavier than usual. I walked toward the elevator area, thinking maybe I'd find someone. The elevator doors were closed and the panel showed that all the cars were idle. I waited a minute, hoping I'd catch some sign of movement. Nothing happened. I went back to my office, locked the door, and decided to finish my work as quickly as possible. Over the weekend, I told myself it was probably just old pipes or something similar. I tried to rationalize it, but on Monday I arrived early in the morning and saw the security guard at the reception desk. I told him I had been hearing noises. He looked at me, scratched his head, and said sometimes the building creaked or carried sound from upper floors. He said it wasn't anything to worry about. Then he joked that the building was old enough to have some ghosts. I forced a smile and changed the subject. I didn't want to push the matter too hard. For a few days, nothing unusual happened. Then, on Wednesday evening, around 7:30 p.m., I was getting ready to leave when the voices came back. This time, I felt more annoyed than scared, at least initially. I wanted to figure out where the noise was coming from. I grabbed my phone and turned on the voice recorder app. I stood near the door, trying to capture the sound. My heart was pounding again, and my hands felt clammy on my phone. I listened for about a minute. I heard the muffled whispers. They seemed a bit louder. I yanked the door open and walked into the corridor, phone in hand, still recording. I said, "Hello?" My voice echoed slightly. The whispering stopped. I moved toward the end of the hall, checking each door. All of them were locked and dark inside. I reached the elevator area. The doors stayed closed. I didn't see or hear anyone. After a few minutes, I stopped recording and went back to my office. When I played the recording, I only heard static and some faint rustling. I couldn't make out any voices on the playback. I started feeling more stressed. My sleep became restless. I kept thinking about what those voices might be. I wondered if maybe there was someone messing with me. But why would anyone bother? The building was mostly filled with offices for accountants, travel agents, and small companies. I didn't know anyone there on a personal level. I tried talking to a neighbor on my floor, a guy who ran a small design firm. He left every day at around 5 p.m., so he had never heard any weird sounds. He shrugged and said it was probably the old ventilation system. After another week of these whispers, I noticed something else: the sense of being watched. Whenever I was in the corridor after 7 p.m., I felt eyes on me. I'd look around and see nothing but the outdated wallpaper and the dim ceiling lights. Yet the sensation didn't go away. It clung to me. My skin crawled when I walked to the elevator at night. My steps sounded too loud on the worn-out tiles. I found myself hurrying, my breath coming quicker, my hand pressing the elevator button with tense force. I just wanted to get out of there. One evening, I decided to stay until I heard the voices again, but this time I wanted to check the other floors. I thought maybe I'd catch some late-night workers or a janitor. So I waited until the whispering started at about 7:20 p.m. I left my office quietly. I took the stairs up one floor. The hall lights were dim there too. I walked slowly, listening for any sign of conversation. I heard nothing. I tried the next floor. Same result. I even checked a few doors, but they were locked. The place looked deserted. I went down to my floor again. The whispers were gone. I felt frustrated and uneasy. My head was pounding a bit, and I noticed sweat trickling down my back. I started dreading the evenings. If I had work that spilled past 6 p.m., I felt a growing anxiety in my chest. I'd glance at my watch, thinking about the time. My heartbeat would speed up around 6:45 p.m., as if my body knew something was about to happen. My legs felt tense, and I had to remind myself to breathe normally. Sometimes I considered leaving early just to avoid hearing the voices, but my workload didn't always allow that. I was trying to make a living, and leaving early meant unfinished tasks. One night, about 2 weeks into this, I decided to bring a small flashlight. The corridor lights were unreliable, and I wanted to feel a bit more secure. Sure enough, around 7 p.m. I heard the faint voices. I walked out with my flashlight in hand. I turned on the corridor switch. The overhead lights flickered. Then they went out, leaving only the emergency lamp. My pulse raced. I shone my flashlight around. The beam illuminated the worn walls. I saw the old bulletin board by the elevator. No new notices, no movements. The voices seemed to grow a bit louder for a second. My heart thumped so hard I thought I'd lose my grip on the flashlight. I took a few steps forward, shining the light left and right. The whispering cut out. Total silence. Then a slight creak in the ceiling. I flashed the light upward. I saw nothing but old tiles. The entire building felt dead and cold. I hurried back into my office and slammed the door. I locked it, sat in my chair, and tried to slow my breathing. I thought about telling the landlord, but I guessed he'd dismiss it as me overreacting. The security guard already joked about ghosts. Nobody else seemed to have problems. So I kept it to myself. The tension built up inside me, and every new whisper felt more disturbing. I didn't smell anything strange or see any physical evidence of intruders, but the feeling of not being alone persisted. One Friday, close to 8 p.m., I was packing my laptop bag when the voices returned. They felt a bit closer, like they were just on the other side of the door. My chest felt tight and I took shallow breaths. I opened my phone's camera, switched to video mode, and pointed it at my door. I pressed record. I didn't say anything. I just wanted proof. As soon as I hit record, the whispering cut off. I waited for almost a minute. My pulse pounded in my temples. I could hear the blood rushing through my ears. Nothing happened. I stopped recording, shook my head in frustration, and decided I'd had enough for the day. As I walked out, I scanned the corridor one last time. The emergency light cast a dull glow. I looked at the ceiling, the walls, the closed doors. Everything looked normal for an old building. My chest was still tight. I felt a small tremor in my hands. I pushed the elevator button. The wait felt longer than usual. I kept turning my head, half expecting to see someone step out from the shadows. When the doors finally opened, I nearly jumped. I got in and pressed the ground floor button. The ride down was slow and silent. My mind raced. I wanted to figure out what was happening in that place, but I also wanted to go home, lock my door, and forget about it. That night I tried to sleep but tossed and turned. I kept imagining the corridor. My head replayed the whispering. My body tensed every time I thought about it. By morning, I had barely slept. I got up, drank some coffee, and told myself I had to get a handle on things. The next week, I tried to schedule all my meetings in the mornings and afternoons. Whenever 6 p.m. rolled around, I felt that knot in my stomach return. One night, I decided to leave earlier than usual. I was exhausted from the stress, but as I stepped into the hallway at 6:30 p.m., I heard a soft shuffle, like someone dragging their feet a bit further down. I froze, shining my phone's flashlight in that direction. I saw no movement. I felt that prickly sensation on my skin. My scalp tingled, my teeth clenched. My breathing got shallow again. I called out, "Hey, is anyone there?" No one answered. I turned around, speed walked to the elevator, and pressed the button repeatedly until it arrived. That was the last straw for me. I realized I couldn't keep ignoring this. The feeling of being watched, the whispers, the lack of any clear explanation, they were getting under my skin. I started looking for a new office that weekend. I didn't want to break my lease abruptly, but I knew I couldn't stay in a place that made me feel so uneasy. My work required focus, and I wasn't getting any peace there. I haven't moved out yet, but I plan to leave as soon as I can. Every day I pack a bit more of my stuff. Every evening I try to finish before that strange hour. If I do hear something, I force myself to ignore it. My body still reacts, though. My hands sweat, my chest tightens, and my mind races. I'm just waiting for the day I can hand in my notice and find a more normal building. Until then, I deal with the tension and that nagging sense that something in the corridors is not quite right. I had just come back from a work trip when I spotted this used stereo system for sale. It was on display in a small second-hand electronics shop near my apartment. The price was decent, and it looked clean. I thought it would be nice to have an older, more solid piece of equipment. I liked the design, and it seemed like a good deal. The first time I tested it in the shop, it played fine. No weird noises, no static. The volume controls worked, and the display lit up in a normal way. I handed the money over without any doubts. I placed the stereo in my living room. My living room is small. There's a couch, a coffee table, a TV on a small stand, and a bookshelf in the corner. I positioned the stereo on a stand near the TV. The first few nights I barely noticed it. I was busy unpacking and catching up on work. I turned it on once or twice to play some old CDs I found in a drawer. It sounded good. The bass was solid, and everything seemed normal. I didn't sense anything unusual at all. The first strange event happened a few days after I brought it home. It was around 2 in the morning. I was asleep in my bedroom down the hall. My bedroom door was closed, but I heard a noise that woke me up. It was a loud static sound. At first, I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I got up, walked toward the hallway, and noticed the static was coming from the living room. I switched on the hallway light. I went into the living room and saw the stereo's display lit up. The volume was at a moderate level, but it was only static. There was no music, no radio station, just that crackling noise. I was confused because I hadn't set any timer, and I was pretty sure I turned it off before going to bed. I walked over to the stereo and pressed the power button. It shut off. The display went dark. I stood there for a moment, feeling a little off balance from being woken up so abruptly. My heart was beating fast because I don't like sudden noises in the middle of the night. I went back to my bedroom, shut the door, and tried to sleep. I told myself it was probably a glitch, or maybe I had hit some random button by accident earlier. The next day, I checked the stereo's buttons. I tried the timer function. It showed off. The instruction manual I found online said you could set a time for it to turn on, but that option was disabled. I tested each button again. Everything felt normal, so I decided not to worry. That night, nothing strange happened. The stereo stayed off. I went to bed without any issues. About 2 nights later, it happened again. It was exactly 2 in the morning. I know that because I looked at the clock on my phone when I woke up. The same static was blasting from the living room. I jumped out of bed. My stomach felt tight, and my nerves were on edge. I walked to the living room again, but this time I didn't turn on the hallway light. I wanted to see the display in the dark. I saw the blue glow on the stereo screen. The tuner was on some random frequency. It was all static, no actual station. I pressed the power button again and it shut off. I felt a chill in my arms. I rubbed them for warmth. Then I went back to bed. I had trouble falling asleep because my mind was racing. I kept thinking about how it turned on at the same time again. The following morning, I unplugged the stereo. I thought that would be a solution. If it's unplugged, it can't turn on, right? I left the cord out of the outlet all day and all night. I didn't plug it back in at any point. I wanted to see if anything unusual would happen. Nothing happened for the next 2 nights. I felt relieved. I told myself I must have had a weird electrical issue or a short inside the stereo. Maybe unplugging it reset something. On the 3rd night, around 1 in the morning, I got up to grab some water from the kitchen. My living room lights were off, and I saw nothing unusual. I went back to bed. Then, at exactly 2 in the morning, I heard the static again. My eyes snapped open. The sound wasn't as loud as before, but it was there. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. I got out of bed slowly. My mouth was dry. I walked toward the living room. The stereo's cord was still unplugged. I saw the plug sitting on the floor. Yet the display was lit. The static was softer but still noticeable. It was like some faint crackling noise coming from the speakers. I leaned in and looked at the display. It showed the same random frequency as before. The volume numbers were around halfway. The power indicator was on. I took a step back because I felt a rush of adrenaline. My heart was pounding. I was sure this wasn't normal. I stood there watching it. My brain was trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe there was still some charge inside the stereo, like a big capacitor holding power, but it had been unplugged for days. That made no sense to me. I reached behind the unit and felt the cool plastic. There was no sign of heat or anything strange. I pressed the power button again. The display went dark. The static stopped. Then I just stood there in silence. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, I decided to inspect everything more carefully. I removed the outer casing of the stereo with a screwdriver. I have some basic knowledge of electronics, though I'm not an expert. I looked at the circuit boards. I didn't see any obvious burn marks or corrosion. The wiring seemed intact. The fuses were fine. Nothing smelled strange. I used a flashlight to check every corner inside. I didn't find loose connections. After that, I put the casing back on, still feeling uneasy. I called a friend of mine who used to fix old electronics. I told him what was going on. He said it might be a faulty power switch or a timer circuit problem. He joked about it being haunted, but I didn't find that funny at the time. He offered to swing by the following weekend to check it out. I agreed. I put the stereo aside, still unplugged, and tried to go about my week as usual. That week was stressful. Work was busy and I had deadlines. My boss kept calling me at odd hours. I wanted to focus on my job, but every night I felt a growing tension in my chest around midnight. I kept waiting for that static to start. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes I'd wake up at 2 in the morning on my own and there was silence. I'd stay awake for minutes, feeling my pulse, listening for any faint noise. Then I'd drift back to sleep, sweaty and anxious. On Thursday night, it happened again. The static blasted at exactly 2 in the morning. I was already on edge, so I jumped out of bed the second I heard it. My legs felt shaky. I rushed into the living room. It was dark, and the stereo was lit up. The same routine. I reached behind it, yanked out the cord. Even though it was already unplugged from the wall, the other end was still attached to the stereo's back. I removed it completely from the unit. The static faded, but it didn't stop abruptly. It kind of sputtered out over a few seconds, almost like it was draining. Then it became silent. I stood there holding the cord in my hand. My breathing was fast. I could feel my heart thudding in my ears. I said out loud, "What the hell?" My voice echoed in the quiet living room. I stared at the stereo. The display was now blank. The apartment felt cold. I didn't see any movement in the hallway or reflection in the TV screen. I just saw myself standing there with a stupid expression on my face, feeling a bit scared. My friend came over that Saturday. I told him the entire story in detail. He smirked a bit, then got to work. He opened the stereo, tested it with some tools, checked the power supply board, the capacitors, and the wiring. He plugged it into a surge protector, turned it on, tested the functions, everything. We sat there for a while, listening to music, messing with the radio tuner. It worked like any normal stereo. No issues at all. He couldn't find a single defect. He told me he'd replace a couple of old capacitors just in case they were storing charge oddly. It was a cheap fix. He did that. Then he packed up his tools and said that would probably solve the weird problems. For the next 2 nights, nothing happened. I slept better. I told myself it must have been a technical glitch. I left the stereo plugged in this time because I wanted to test it properly. On the 3rd night after the repair, I was in bed scrolling through my phone. It was around 1:50 a.m. I felt a slight sense of unease, but I tried to stay calm. Then, right at 2 in the morning, I heard the stereo click. It wasn't static at first. It was a low humming noise like a dead air signal. I got up, walked to the living room, and stood there. The display was lit. It was on the radio tuner again, stuck in that same frequency range. After a few seconds, the static burst out. It was louder than usual. I stepped back. I felt sweat gathering around my forehead. My stomach hurt from the tension. My shoulders felt stiff. I pressed the power button. It didn't respond immediately. I pressed it again, harder. Nothing changed. I tapped all the buttons, volume, tuner, even the CD tray button. None of them worked. The static kept going. I felt a jolt of panic. I reached for the outlet and pulled the plug from the wall. The stereo kept playing static. The light stayed on. I felt my pulse hammering against my neck. I stared at it, unsure what to do. I crouched down, grabbed a flashlight from the coffee table drawer, and shone it around the side of the stereo. There was nothing unusual there. The back panel was secure. I fiddled with the cord. The stereo still emitted that harsh noise. I decided to wait and watch. My eyes were locked on the display. After about a minute, the sound started fading. It went from harsh static to a softer crackle, then silence. The lights on the display flickered twice, then went out. I stayed in that position for at least another minute, not moving. My knees hurt from crouching. My arms shook. I stayed quiet, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing else happened. I placed the cord on the coffee table and stepped away. I felt weak. My shirt was damp from sweating. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, I took the stereo and put it in the hallway closet. I pushed it behind some boxes and closed the door. I didn't want to see it. My friend called me later to ask how it was going. I told him the issue was still there, but I didn't give details. He offered to take the stereo off my hands to tinker with it more thoroughly. I said I'd let him know. That was a few days ago. I haven't touched it since. My living room is quiet now. I'm still tense at night, especially around that same time. I keep expecting to hear that static start up again. Sometimes I'll get up around 2 in the morning and walk to the living room just to be sure I'm not imagining anything. It's always silent in there. The stereo remains in the closet. It's unplugged. I have no plans to plug it in again. I don't have a logical explanation. I just know that every time it turned itself on, my heart pounded and my mind raced. I don't like that feeling. I might give it to my friend and forget about it. I don't want it in my apartment anymore. I don't think I can relax while it's around. I have never experienced anything like this before. I'm not saying it's supernatural. Maybe there's a malfunction that nobody can fix easily. Maybe there's something else going on. All I know is that it kept happening at the same time, and it kept making that static noise that felt overwhelming when I heard it. My chest still tightens when I remember how the display refused to shut off even after I unplugged it. Right now, I'm just trying to get back to normal. I watch TV, turn on my lamps at night, and try not to think about that stereo. But I won't deny that it still bothers me. Every time my air conditioner or fridge clicks on at night, I get a flash of worry. I breathe out and remind myself it's just standard noise. Then I try to go back to sleep. That's what my life looks like now. And that's the end of it. At least I hope it is. I remember the first time I took the overnight shift at that parking garage. They gave me a small office on the ground floor with a bunch of monitors, some old radio equipment, and a cheap desk lamp. The garage had multiple levels above ground and 2 levels below, and I was supposed to watch the entire place from midnight to 8 in the morning. It sounded like easy work. At first, I thought I'd just be drinking coffee and trying not to fall asleep. I never expected anything strange. I never expected to get so jumpy that I'd hesitate before stepping out of the elevator, especially on the second sublevel at 3 in the morning. I want to talk about what happened on those nights. I'll keep it straightforward because that's how I remember it. No fluff or anything like that. Just the facts of what I saw, what I heard, and how it made me feel. When I started, the first couple of shifts were quiet. It's a regular parking garage, and at night you mostly get a few folks who forgot their cars or needed to pick them up late. Sometimes there's a small rush around midnight from people coming back from bars or late-night events. After that, it's dead quiet. The cameras feed into a single monitor that cycles through each level. There's a separate small split-screen setup for the sublevels because they're usually empty at night, so my boss wanted them visible at all times. Around the 3rd or 4th night, I noticed something odd. It was about 3 in the morning, and I was sipping coffee while looking at the monitor for the sublevels. The second sublevel camera got all screwed up. The image blurred and flickered. It looked like the feed had some kind of static interference. I made a mental note about it and waited a few seconds. It cleared up on its own. I figured it was a glitch. Electronics do that sometimes. But it happened again the next night at almost the exact same time. This time, it only lasted a couple of seconds, but it was enough for me to see a shape on the screen. It was like a vertical form off to the side near one of the concrete pillars. It happened so fast that I thought it might just be a weird artifact from the distortion, but it stuck in my head. I told myself, I'll keep an eye on it tomorrow. Sure enough, on the following night, the same interference showed up at 3 in the morning on the second sub-level camera. It flickered in and out, and there was this shape again. It looked like a person's outline. Then it disappeared. The camera feed went back to normal like nothing happened. I felt a chill in my arms. My pulse got faster. I don't usually get spooked easily. I've worked in other security jobs before, and weird stuff on camera feeds usually ends up being a rodent, a bird, or some reflection of a car's headlights. But in a sub-level at 3 in the morning, there's no direct light from outside, and there's barely any movement. It didn't make sense. I decided to check it out in person. I left my office, took the elevator down to the first sub-level, and then walked down the ramp to the second sub-level. My footsteps echoed. That place always felt a bit cooler than the rest of the building, probably because it's deeper underground. The overhead lights are spaced out, so there are patches of dim spots near the corners. I went straight to the pillar where I had seen the shape on the monitor. Nothing was there, just concrete and a slight oil stain on the ground. When I turned to head back, I swore I saw movement in my peripheral vision. I whipped around fast, shining my flashlight. Nothing. It's normal to imagine things when you're alone in a silent garage, but my heart was already pounding. I could feel sweat forming on my neck. I walked around that entire sub-level, checking behind every pillar, near all the parked cars and by the exit ramps. No one was around. Not a single car door open, not a single figure. I couldn't explain it, but I felt a heavy sensation in my chest, like the air was colder and thicker down there. I went back upstairs and checked the tape to see if maybe I had missed something. The recording showed the same flicker, the same distortion, but it was too scrambled to confirm a shape. It only lasted about 3 seconds, then went back to normal. I told my supervisor the next day. He shrugged and said it was probably a glitch and that I should keep an eye on it. He didn't seem concerned. He said, "If it keeps happening, we'll get someone to fix the camera." I didn't like his answer. It felt dismissive, but he's the boss. I couldn't force him to do anything. The next few nights I tried to keep my mind off it, but I dreaded that moment around 3 in the morning. Each time the clock approached 3, I found myself gripping the desk or adjusting the monitor brightness, trying to see if maybe the camera would be okay. But each time I saw that flicker. Sometimes it happened right at 3. Sometimes it happened at 3:01 or 3:02. But it was always in that window. The distortion would shake the image, and for a split second I could make out what looked like a torso and a head shape. It's never crisp or clear. It's always ghostly, like a silhouette. That alone was enough to make me uneasy. One night, I decided I had to be on the second sub-level at exactly 3 in the morning to see if there was a real person messing around. Maybe it was some prank. Maybe there was a trespasser who knew where the camera blind spots were. I positioned myself near that same pillar. The smell of gasoline and concrete was in the air. The floor had tire marks and small puddles of leaked fluids. The ceiling lights hummed softly. I checked my phone every few seconds. At 2:59, I switched off my phone screen and kept my flashlight pointed at the ground. I waited. The hum of the lights and the faint dripping sound from a pipe in the corner were the only noises. My eyes darted around, trying to catch any sign of movement. 3 short hit. I held my breath. For a few seconds, nothing. Then I heard a scrape. It sounded like someone's shoe sliding on concrete. My heart rate jumped. I spun toward the sound. I didn't see anything, but I felt something. My arms had goosebumps, and it felt like the temperature had dropped a few degrees. I took a few steps forward, shining my flashlight between rows of parked cars. Empty. I heard a soft whoosh, like a quick rush of air coming from behind me. I turned again, but there was no one there. I called out, "Hello?" My voice bounced off the walls. No response. I felt a tingling sensation in my stomach. It was like my body wanted me to get out of there. I told myself to stay calm and keep looking, but I couldn't deny the tension in my muscles. My breathing got shallow. I checked the time on my phone. 3:02. 2 minutes felt like a lifetime. I decided I had seen enough and needed to check the monitor again. I hurried to the elevator, pressed the button, and waited. The wait felt too long. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting something to appear in my flashlight beam. When the doors finally slid open, I backed in, still holding the flashlight out toward the dark garage. The elevator doors closed, and I felt a small wave of relief. Back in my office, I replayed the feed. Sure enough, the camera flickered at exactly 3:01 and stayed distorted until 3:02. I could see a faint shadowy figure near where I had been standing. I felt a jolt run down my spine. It looked close to me on the screen, but I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. It was like it only existed in that electronic distortion. After that, I started dreading the second sublevel. Every time I did rounds, I felt my skin crawl when I got off the elevator. I'd shine my flashlight around quickly, not wanting to linger. My body would tense up, and my mouth would go dry. I'd check the corners, the pillars, and the back rows of cars. Nothing. Then I'd hustle back to the elevator. Sometimes I thought I heard faint footsteps echoing or a low scrape against the floor. Other times, I felt a slight breeze that shouldn't have been there. But I never saw anyone in person. I also noticed that nothing odd ever happened outside that 3 a.m. window. During the rest of the night, the camera feed was stable. No strange shapes, no flickering. It was like clockwork. 3 a.m. came, the camera glitched, and I felt this heavy unease. After a while, I tried telling a coworker about it when I saw him before my shift. He laughed it off and said, "Weird stuff happens in these old garages." He didn't seem too interested. I talked to the building manager once. He said they'd had a few complaints about random interference on that level, but no one ever followed up. He figured it was a wiring issue. He promised to send a maintenance guy to look at the cables. That didn't change how I felt. By then, I was convinced something was down there. Not necessarily a ghost, but something. Maybe a real person who knew how to avoid me. Maybe there was a problem with the layout of the garage causing illusions. I couldn't pin it down, but I knew it wasn't normal. Each night I walked in with a knot in my stomach. I'd spend the first few hours on edge. Around 2:45 a.m., I'd start feeling my heart rate pick up again. My hands would get clammy, and I'd keep looking over at the split-screen sub-level feed. When the interference happened, I felt my body tense automatically. Sometimes I'd stand up, ready to run down there, but most nights I didn't. It felt pointless. Every time I checked, I found nothing but empty corners and that weird sensation of being watched. One night, about 2 weeks into this, I was sitting there watching the main monitors. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard a distant clang from somewhere in the building. It wasn't on the cameras, so I got up and walked the levels with my flashlight and radio. Nothing seemed out of place. I ended up on the first sub-level. The lights flickered for a second, and I thought maybe the power was on the fritz. Then I heard a metallic thump below me, like something hitting a pipe or a guardrail on the second sub-level. My breathing quickened. I really didn't want to go down there alone, but it's my job, so I took the ramp down. When I stepped onto the second sub-level, it was 2:50 a.m. The place felt colder than usual. I could smell damp concrete. My flashlight beam shook a little because my hand was shaking. I checked behind each concrete pillar. I looked under every parked car. I saw nothing. The only sound was my own footsteps. After a minute, I tried to relax. My heart was still racing, but I told myself it was just the building settling. I found no sign of any intruder or vandalism. Then I noticed one of the overhead lights at the far end of the sublevel blinking on and off. It cast weird, moving shadows across the floor. It was probably just a bad bulb, but it made everything feel more ominous. I stood there, watching it flicker. Then I remembered the time. 2:59 a.m. My stomach dropped. I knew that in a matter of seconds the camera feed upstairs would start distorting. I glanced at my phone. It turned 3:00 a.m. on the dot. I looked up at that flickering light. My flashlight beam could only do so much. Then I heard it again, that soft scraping sound like a shoe dragging across the floor. It came from somewhere behind the row of cars on my left. I swallowed hard. My throat felt tight. I couldn't move at first. It was like my legs locked up. Eventually, I forced myself to step forward. I moved slowly between two parked sedans, shining my flashlight side to side. I checked under the cars. Empty. When I came out the other side, the scrape sounded behind me again. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped. My flashlight passed over concrete and the edges of the cars, but I didn't see anyone. I thought I saw a dark shape vanish behind a pillar, but when I aimed the flashlight there, it was gone. That's when the overhead light stopped flickering. The garage was suddenly evenly lit again, which made the shadows disappear, but it felt even more unsettling because I had nowhere to blame the darkness. Everything was visible, yet there was nothing there. I felt sweat running down the back of my neck. My heart thudded so hard in my chest that I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. The silence after the scraping noise was deafening. I called out, "Is anyone here?" But I got no answer. I felt that same chill like a breeze passing by. It cut right through my uniform and I shivered. I decided I couldn't stay down there any longer. I walked quickly toward the elevator. My footsteps echoed. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see a shadow creeping up on me. I pressed the elevator button repeatedly, cursing under my breath for it to hurry up. When I got back into the office, the monitor showed the usual flicker. That was the last straw for me. I wrote a detailed report. I told my supervisor I wasn't comfortable checking that sub-level alone at 3 in the morning anymore. He gave me a long look and said he'd consider assigning someone else, or at least letting me do the sub-level checks earlier. But nothing really changed. I still do my rounds, and I still see that camera glitch at 3 in the morning. That shadow shape appears like a distorted outline, almost like it's testing my nerves. I do the bare minimum down there now. I keep my distance from that pillar. Every time I see the interference on the feed, I feel a surge of adrenaline, a tension in my chest that doesn't go away until after I've left the building at the end of my shift. I know some people won't believe me, but this is exactly what I've experienced. The repeated interference, the strange shape, the chills, and those scraping sounds. I haven't found a logical explanation yet. That's my story. I'm just a night watchman trying to do my job, but that second sub-level isn't right at 3 in the morning. I can't prove it's anything supernatural or if it's just some bizarre technical glitch combined with my own nerves. All I know is, every time I'm in that garage at night, I keep one eye on the clock. Because once it hits 3, I know something is going to happen down there, and I still don't have answers. I showed up at Miguel's house on a Friday afternoon with 2 bags and a lot of curiosity. The place was smaller than I expected. It had a narrow corridor, a dusty living room, and walls that looked like they needed a fresh coat of paint. At first glance, it felt normal, like an older home that someone decided to turn into a budget-friendly lodging option. But something felt off. I noticed a door at the far end of the hallway that seemed different from the other doors. It was locked. Miguel pointed me toward the second door on the right and told me that was my room. I walked past that locked door and felt a slight chill. It was the kind of moment that raises the hairs on your arms. Nothing dramatic, just a subtle feeling that something wasn't right. I put my bags down in my room and looked around. It was plain. There was a single bed, a small desk, and a window that overlooked the backyard. The bedsheets smelled clean, which was good. I had arrived after a long bus ride, so I wanted to take a quick shower before heading out to explore the area. On my way to the bathroom, I passed the locked door again. This time, I noticed a small gap at the bottom. The wood was a bit warped, probably from moisture. When I looked closer, I thought I saw a faint light flickering inside. It wasn't constant. It pulsed once or twice and then stopped. At the time, I brushed it off as a reflection of something outside. After my shower, I felt more relaxed. I changed clothes and went to the kitchen to get some water. Miguel was there, cutting vegetables. I asked him about that locked door. He smiled in a weird way and said the room was full of old boxes and random stuff he hadn't organized. He mentioned that he never used it and that the key had disappeared months ago. He joked that he wasn't a handyman, so he never bothered to fix the lock or break it open. I laughed politely and let the subject drop. But I kept thinking about the light I saw. I told myself it was my imagination or a reflection from passing cars on the street. That night, I went to bed around 11. I was exhausted, but my sleep was restless. The hallway was dark, and the old pipes in the house made odd knocking sounds. Sometimes I would drift off and then wake up to a clank or a drip. At around 2 in the morning, I got up to use the bathroom. I heard a quiet scratching noise from the corridor. I opened my door slowly and peeked out. I saw a faint flicker of light underneath that locked door. It flickered, then went out, then flickered again. My heart started pounding. I stood there for a few seconds, watching that dull glow. It almost looked like someone was inside with a small flashlight, turning it on and off. Then it stopped completely. I went back into my room and locked the door. I had a hard time falling asleep. My mind kept replaying that sight. I wondered if Miguel was messing with me or if there was someone else staying in the house. Maybe he was renting that room out in secret, or there was a friend crashing there. But if that was the case, why lie about it? In the morning, I found Miguel in the kitchen again, making coffee. I asked him if he'd gone into the locked room last night. He looked at me in a puzzled way, shook his head, and said he didn't go near it. He also said he was a heavy sleeper and rarely got up in the middle of the night. I told him I saw lights. He shrugged, said the hallway's electrical wiring might be causing weird reflections, and then changed the subject. His behavior felt evasive, but I didn't want to push too hard. I was there as a guest and I didn't want to offend him. Later that day, I went out to pick up some supplies. I had planned to stay there for a couple of weeks. It was cheaper than a regular hotel, and Miguel had always been a decent acquaintance. We weren't close friends, but we'd known each other for a few years from a previous job. I figured maybe he was telling the truth about the junk in that room. Maybe the light I saw was just something else, but the memory stuck with me. That night, I spent a couple of hours reading in my room. Around midnight, I heard a low hum, like static from an old radio. I turned off my bedside lamp and listened. The hum grew louder, then softer, like it was coming from the other side of the hallway. I got out of bed, opened my door, and walked slowly toward that locked door. The rest of the house was silent. The hum sounded like voices but drowned out by static, like a bad transmission. I kneeled and tried to look through the gap at the bottom of the door. I couldn't see anything except a faint glow. My heart was racing, and I started sweating. My mouth felt dry, and I realized I was holding my breath. I exhaled quietly and reached for the doorknob. It was locked. I turned it a bit harder, but it wouldn't budge. Then the light inside disappeared, and the hum stopped. Total silence. I stood there in the dark, feeling a knot in my stomach. Part of me wanted to knock or call out to see if anyone would answer, but I didn't. I went back to my room, locked the door, and stayed awake for hours. My thoughts circled around 100 different explanations. Maybe there was a faulty device inside. Maybe it was an old TV turning on by itself. Maybe someone was messing with me. My hands were trembling and my body felt tense. I tried to distract myself by reading, but my eyes kept drifting toward the hallway. In the morning, I confronted Miguel again. I told him I heard strange sounds and saw lights. He said I must have been dreaming. I told him I was definitely awake. He just smiled and said I was spooking myself. I asked if I could at least check the room, but he claimed he didn't have the key and that it was probably lost somewhere. I asked if we could force the door open. He became defensive and said he wasn't going to damage his own house over a weird suspicion. His attitude frustrated me. I felt like leaving, but I had already paid for the next few days, and I wasn't exactly swimming in money to go book a hotel. So I stayed. The next day, the entire atmosphere of the house felt heavier. I went outside for a walk, got a sandwich, and tried to stay out until the evening. When I came back, I noticed that the hallway smelled musty, like old fabric or damp cardboard. The locked door looked more worn than before, with chips in the paint and a small scratch near the handle. I placed my ear against it and listened. I heard faint rustling, like someone shifting boxes. I knocked softly. No response. I pressed my ear again. Nothing. Then I heard a quick shuffle, like feet moving over the floor. My heart beat faster and my hands got clammy. I knocked again, louder this time. Still no answer. I went to find Miguel, but he wasn't around. I tried to distract myself by cooking dinner. The kitchen was cramped, but I managed to fry some eggs and warm up leftovers. I ate quickly and then decided to check if Miguel had returned. I found him in the living room smoking a cigarette. He rarely smoked, so it was odd to see him doing that. His eyes looked tired and he seemed preoccupied. I asked if everything was okay. He nodded but looked away. I wanted to ask about the door again, but I sensed he wasn't in the mood. The tension in the room was thick. I could feel it in my stomach like a heavy weight pressing down. Later that night, around 1 in the morning, I decided I wasn't going to just listen anymore. I got out of bed, grabbed a small flashlight I had brought with me and tiptoed to that locked door. I crouched down, aimed the flashlight at the gap, and turned it on. I saw shadows on the floor inside, like piles of boxes. I couldn't see much, just outlines and corners. Then a small point of light flashed inside the room like a response to my flashlight. My heart started racing. It flickered once, twice, then stopped. I felt like I was locked in some bizarre silent conversation with whoever or whatever was in there. I turned off my flashlight and listened. I heard a soft hiss, like a whisper. It sent a chill through my entire body. It was gentle but eerie, like someone was speaking in the lowest possible voice. I tried the door again. It was still locked. I jiggled the knob and I heard movement inside, like something or someone shifting around. My breaths became shallow and I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. I leaned my forehead against the door, feeling a rush of adrenaline. I wanted to kick it open, but I didn't have the nerve. I whispered, "Hello? Is anyone in there?" No response. Just silence. I crept back to my room, laid down on the bed, and stared at the ceiling. My mind wouldn't stop racing. My gut told me something was very wrong. Miguel's behavior, the lights, the sounds, it all felt too deliberate to be random. I barely slept. The house was quiet for the rest of the night, or I was too lost in my own thoughts to notice anything else. The next morning I went to Miguel and told him plainly, "I think there's someone in that room. I heard noises, I saw lights, I heard a whisper." He refused to look me in the eye. He mumbled something about old electrical problems and insisted the door stayed locked. I asked if we could call a locksmith to open it and check. He said no. We argued. He got angry and told me that if I didn't like his house, I could leave. I was tempted to walk out right then, but my curiosity was stronger than my pride. I told him I'd stay until the end of the week, as planned. He just nodded, stubbed out his cigarette, and walked away without another word. Over the next few days, I tried to ignore the situation. I went about my business, exploring the town, eating out, and coming back to the house only to sleep. But every night the same pattern repeated. Around midnight or 1 in the morning, I'd see those lights under the door, or I'd hear that static-like hiss. Sometimes I could swear it sounded like multiple voices. Other times it was just a soft glow and no sound. I kept telling myself I was only hearing things, but my instincts told me otherwise. By the end of the week, I was on edge. I felt jumpy, like I was constantly looking over my shoulder. I confronted Miguel one last time before I left. I asked him to be honest with me about what was in that room. He said it was just clutter and nothing more. I asked why I kept seeing those lights. He shrugged. I asked why I heard whispers. He just said the pipes were old, and that maybe water pressure was causing odd sounds. I knew he was lying. He looked uncomfortable. He brushed me off and left the room. I packed my bags the next morning and took one last look at that locked door. The paint was peeling, and there was dust along the edges. It stood there, silent and mysterious. Part of me wanted to kick it open, but I didn't. I left the key to my own room on the kitchen table and walked out. On my way down the corridor, I thought I caught a tiny flicker of light from under that door. I paused, but I didn't investigate any further. I caught a bus out of town and tried to clear my head during the ride. Even now, I still don't have a clear explanation. I keep wondering what was really inside that room and why Miguel acted so strange about it. I never got a straight answer from him. Sometimes I wonder if there was an actual person in there, or if it was just something electrical. The low hiss and the flickering lights stay in my memory, like a looping tape I can't erase. I don't tell too many people about it because it sounds ridiculous, but I know what I saw and heard. I remember the locked doorknob, the flicker of light, and the low static that sounded like whispers. It felt like that door had its own pulse. Even now, I can't shake the uneasy feeling I had in that hallway. It's like the house was alive in some corner I couldn't reach, and that room stayed locked, holding secrets I'll probably never uncover. I never thought I'd hear footsteps in an empty corridor at night, but that's exactly what happened. I wasn't prepared for it. I was just doing my job. I want to explain every detail so you can understand why I don't work at night anymore. My name is Daniel, and I'm in charge of a small building materials warehouse. It's not a fancy place. We have shelves, pallets, boxes, and a few offices up front. The business itself isn't big, but we handle enough stock that I need to stay organized. The warehouse is basically a big concrete box with tall metal racks and a few fluorescent lights. During the day, it's just me and a couple of workers. We unload trucks, store the materials, and keep things neat. But on some nights, I have to do inventory checks alone because it's easier when nobody else is moving things around. This particular night, I stayed late because the numbers weren't adding up. I had a clipboard with me and a small flashlight. Our overhead lights sometimes flicker, and a few sections of the warehouse are dim, so I like having the flashlight handy. It was a normal evening at first. I locked the front door so no one would come in. I turned off most of the overhead lights except in the areas I needed to check. The place was quiet. I only heard the buzz from the old lights and the slight hum from the mini fridge in the break area. I started around 7 p.m. and planned to finish by 9 p.m. I figured I'd count the sacks of cement, check the boxes of screws and nails, and confirm the metal beams. It shouldn't have taken long, but I was meticulous. I recounted a few times because the earlier day's numbers looked off. That's how I lost track of time. Before I knew it, it was pushing 10:30 p.m. I remember looking at my watch and feeling a bit uneasy. I don't usually stay that late. The warehouse has rows and rows of tall shelves. After the overhead lights go off in the far sections, those shelves look like dark walls. I felt a little jumpy, but told myself to get it done. It was just me in there. Nobody else had a key, and the place was locked. I walked down one of the main aisles to our small side corridor, which is normally stacked with boxes of tile. The corridor leads to the back entrance we rarely use. That area is always dark because the overhead light there burnt out a few months ago. We put it on a list of repairs, but it never got done. I only had my flashlight. The corridor was quiet and I didn't see anything unusual. I climbed a small stepladder to check the top boxes. I was careful not to slip. As I was counting, I thought I heard something. It sounded like footsteps crossing the concrete floor. Not a shuffle or a random creak, but distinct steps. Like boots. 3 or 4 steps in a row. I froze. My first thought was maybe someone got inside, or one of my co-workers came back. But I locked the door, and nobody has a spare key except the owner. I pointed my flashlight toward the sound. There was nothing there. I waited and listened. Total silence. My heart started pounding a bit. I told myself it might have been my own movement causing an echo. The building sometimes makes weird noises. It's old. The metal beams flex with temperature, and the concrete floor can carry sound in strange ways. I went back to my counting, tried to shrug it off, and finished that row. I moved to the next aisle, double-checking the boxes of nails and the stacks of sheetrock. My flashlight flickered for a second, so I tapped it. The beam steadied. I was getting a little tense, but I tried to ignore it. Then I heard footsteps again. Clack, clack, clack across the floor, clear as day. I spun around with the flashlight. The corridor where I'd just been stood empty. My pulse raced. I broke out in a cold sweat under my shirt. I had this sudden urge to call out, "Hello? Who's there?" But my throat felt dry. I managed a weak, "Hello?" No response, no movement, just that buzzing sound from the lights in the background. I walked over to the corridor. My steps were slow, and I held the flashlight in front of me like I expected someone to jump out. But the corridor was empty, and those tall piles of boxes were undisturbed. I checked the back door. It was still locked from the inside, the bolt secured. There was no sign anyone got in. I forced myself to keep going. I thought maybe I was just on edge. I glanced at my watch. It was around 10:50 p.m. I decided I'd do one more aisle and call it a night. I grabbed my clipboard, forced a deep breath, and went to the section where we keep the bags of cement mix. It's near the center of the warehouse where the main overhead lights were still on. It felt safer there. I started counting the stacks, noting each pallet on my sheet. I was determined to finish as quickly as possible. That's when I heard it a third time. Those steps were even louder, like someone walking with purpose. It came from that same corridor. This time it wasn't just a few steps. I heard what sounded like a slow pace coming down the length of the corridor. Each step was distinct. I felt this flash of fear. My body tensed. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I could feel sweat rolling down my temple. My brain was telling me something was off. Nobody should be there. Yet the sound was so clear. I shouted, "Who's in here? This is private property." My voice echoed off the concrete walls. The footsteps stopped. Immediately after they stopped, the entire warehouse fell silent, like everything was holding its breath. I just stood there, frozen, flashlight shaking in my hand. My heart thumped in my chest. I kept waiting for someone to answer, to show themselves, or to run. But nothing happened. I tried to gather the courage to go look again, but my feet felt heavy. After a few seconds, I forced myself to move. I walked toward the corridor, my hands trembling. I scanned the flashlight beam across the floor, up the walls, through the rows of boxes. No one was there. I saw no movement, no shadow, nothing. The corridor was the same. Boxes neatly stacked, the path clear. I rubbed my forehead. I felt a headache forming from stress. I told myself maybe I was hearing echoes again, or maybe an animal had gotten in, though those footsteps sounded too big for a rat. I decided to finish the count and get out. I headed back to the pallet area, wrote down a final number, and began to gather my stuff. I was stepping away from the pallets when I heard a loud crash. It sounded like something heavy falling over. I nearly dropped my clipboard. The noise echoed through the warehouse. It came from that same corridor. I felt a jolt in my chest. That was not just footsteps. Something actually fell. I started breathing fast. My mind raced. Was there an intruder messing with me? Did a stack of boxes collapse? I didn't want to check, but I had no choice. I walked down the aisle, each step feeling heavier. My flashlight beam bounced on the walls because my hand was shaking. The corridor was dark, so I followed the sound carefully. When I reached the spot, I saw one of the boxes on the ground, turned on its side. It looked like it had been knocked off a short stack. This box held small tiles. They were partly spilled out on the floor. The area wasn't a mess, but it was enough to see it had definitely been pushed or dropped. There was no reason for it to fall on its own. It was stable when I checked it earlier. I felt a chill through my entire body. My heart hammered in my chest. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but I didn't see any sign of a person. No footprints, no open door. Nothing out of place except that box. I felt completely uneasy. My mouth was dry, and my legs felt weak. I thought maybe I should check behind the larger stacks, but some instinct told me to get out. It felt wrong to stay. I was convinced I was alone, yet I had no explanation for what just happened. I took a few quick photos on my phone, thinking I might need to show someone. Then I grabbed the box and set it upright, but my hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it again. My chest felt tight. I looked around one more time, shining the light in every corner. The entire place seemed still and silent, like I was the only living thing in there. But my nerves were shot. I couldn't stay. I walked back to the main section, picked up my backpack, and headed straight to the front door. As I left, I locked up behind me, checked the handle twice, and walked to my car in the empty parking lot. It was quiet outside, and the streetlights cast a dim glow. I sat in my car for a moment, trying to process what happened. My breath felt shaky. My shirt was damp from sweat. I kept replaying the sounds in my head. Footsteps in a place with no one around, then a box knocked over. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there's a weird acoustics effect, maybe a rodent nudged the box. But the footsteps sounded too real, too precise. And that box was stable before. I got home around midnight. I couldn't relax. I tossed and turned for hours, picturing that dark corridor and imagining someone standing there, just beyond the flashlight's reach. The next morning, I told my coworkers what happened, but I felt embarrassed. I described hearing footsteps and finding a box on the floor. A few of them joked it was a ghost. One thought maybe a homeless person snuck in. Another suggested an animal. Nobody had a definitive answer. I checked the security cameras, but we only have them near the entrance, not in the side corridor. The footage showed no one entering or leaving except me. Since that night, I won't do inventory checks after dark. I'll come in early before the shift starts, or I'll do it on a weekend morning when there's some sunlight. I don't care if it means rearranging my schedule. I just can't stand the idea of being alone in that silent warehouse late at night, thinking I might hear those footsteps again. I tried to put it out of my mind, but it stuck with me. Anytime I hear a random noise in there, I get that same uneasy feeling, like I'm waiting for something to show itself. Over time, I convinced myself it must have been some fluke, maybe stress or the building's weird acoustics, but there's still a part of me that can't explain the box getting knocked over. If it was balanced fine earlier, what made it fall? It's not like we had an earthquake or a big vibration. And those footsteps were so distinct. Whenever I think about it, my stomach clenches. I feel that tension in my shoulders. Even writing down the inventory numbers by the corridor during the day makes my hands tremble a bit. I told my boss about it. He didn't laugh or anything. He just looked at me like he didn't quite believe it, but he wasn't going to question it too much. He said if it bothered me that much, I could do the counts during normal business hours. So I do. I haven't stayed past 8 p.m. since then. I make sure all the lights are off and the door is locked while there's still sunlight. I double-check everything before leaving, then I go home. I let the nighttime emptiness belong to itself. Sometimes I wonder if there really is some stranger coming in and messing around, or maybe something else is going on that I don't understand. I never found a solid explanation. All I know is I can't handle that tension anymore. Hearing something walk through that quiet place, seeing a box fall without anyone to push it, those moments made my skin crawl. The sensation was too vivid. The warehouse still looks the same. Rows of shelves, stacks of boxes, the occasional flickering light. But it feels different to me now. I don't trust those silent corridors when it's late. I try not to think about it too much, but it's always in the back of my mind. If I'm alone in there, even during the day, I sometimes imagine hearing that steady step on the concrete, and each time I do, I feel a knot tighten in my chest. That's my story. It's not dramatic in a big horror movie sense. I wasn't attacked, and I didn't see an actual figure. But that almost makes it worse for me, because it's all in that unknown space. The footsteps were real enough for me. The fallen box was real. I can't explain it. I can only say that it happened, and I hate that I don't have a reason for it. All I know is I'm not going to be there alone at night again. Once was enough. If you were in my position, maybe you'd do the same. If something like that ever happens to you, you might understand this feeling. That sense that there's something present, even if you can't see it. It's like the emptiness itself came alive. And I want no part of it, especially when the lights are off and nobody else is around. I'd rather finish my inventory in broad daylight. with all the machines running and people talking, so I don't have to listen for footsteps that shouldn't be there. I want to start by saying this isn't the kind of story I ever expected to tell. It's something I'd usually shrug off as my imagination going wild or some trick of the light. But after these last few weeks, I can't ignore it anymore. It all started with an old mirror I inherited from my great-uncle. I didn't know him well. He was just that relative everyone talked about but rarely visited. When he passed away, I got this huge mirror with a dark wooden frame. The frame had these carved patterns along the edges, kind of worn down but still impressive. My mother said it was from the 19th century, though I never verified that. The mirror itself looked normal enough at first glance. Some scratches, a faint cloudy patch in one corner, but nothing dramatic. I decided to hang it in the hallway of my house. My place isn't huge, but I have a fairly long corridor. It has plain white walls, overhead lights, and a few family photos. There was a spot on the wall near the end of the corridor that was perfect. I remember carrying the mirror in, almost dropped it once because it was heavier than I expected. I used some sturdy wall anchors and prayed it wouldn't come crashing down in the middle of the night. Once it was up, I stepped back and felt pretty proud of myself for getting it level on the first try. The next couple of days were uneventful. Every time I walked by the mirror, I just caught a glimpse of myself. You know how it is. Sometimes you look, sometimes you don't. But I started having this weird sensation whenever I passed by. It was like I wasn't alone. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone behind me. I live alone, so there's no reason I should feel that way. I tried to brush it off as just stress from work or something like that. About a week after the mirror went up, I had the strangest feeling while walking down the hallway at night. I'd turned off the living room lights and was heading to my bedroom. The hallway was dim, lit only by a small lamp near the front door. When I walked in front of the mirror, I felt a sudden chill. The air felt heavier, like I was carrying an extra load on my shoulders. I stopped, looked at my reflection, and noticed nothing unusual. Just me, half tired, wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants. I shrugged it off, took a deep breath, and went to bed. The next morning, everything seemed fine again. The hallway was bright and I saw my reflection clearly. I still felt a bit uneasy, but I tried to ignore it. Throughout the day, I crossed the hallway several times, usually in a hurry. But later that afternoon, I swear I saw something off about my reflection. It's hard to explain. It seemed to move a fraction of a second slower than me. I raised my hand to rub my face, and there was this barely noticeable lag. It was like I turned my head, and the reflection was half a beat behind. When I focused hard, it disappeared and everything looked normal. I felt my heart rate pick up. My palms got sweaty. I stood there for a few minutes, raising my arms, turning my head side to side, trying to catch that lag again. But I couldn't. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. I went about my day and tried to forget it. That night, though, I kept thinking about it. I lay in bed, staring at the dark, wondering if I was going crazy. I decided to test it again the next morning. So the following day, I grabbed my phone and stood in front of the mirror. I recorded myself doing slow movements, turning my head, lifting my arms, bending a little, then checking the video. It showed nothing out of the ordinary. Everything was in sync. I thought maybe that would put my mind at ease, but it didn't. I still felt this uneasy vibe around that mirror. I started walking faster through the hallway, barely glancing at it. I kept telling myself there was nothing there, but the feeling wouldn't go away. One evening I came home late from work. The hallway was dark, and I felt that chill again. I hurried to switch on the lights. At first everything was normal. But the moment I walked in front of the mirror, I saw my reflection do something I definitely didn't do. It looked like my reflection's shoulder twitched or jerked slightly when my shoulder didn't move. I jumped back, almost losing my balance. My heart slammed in my chest and I felt this surge of adrenaline. I stood there staring at the mirror, breathing hard. My reflection looked totally normal again. I stood as still as I could, hoping I'd catch it in the act. Nothing happened. Minutes passed. I probably looked like an idiot standing there, phone in hand, but I was scared. I recorded another video. Again, the playback showed me standing perfectly still. No weird movements, no delays. I felt this wave of nausea. Not because I was physically sick, but because I realized I couldn't prove what I saw. It was only happening when I wasn't actively trying to film it, or it was so subtle it wouldn't appear on camera. I went to the kitchen, grabbed a glass of water, and tried to calm down. My thoughts raced. I considered taking the mirror off the wall and storing it somewhere. But it belonged to my great-uncle, and part of me didn't want to just toss it in the garage. Plus, I wasn't totally convinced there was anything supernatural going on. Maybe I was tired, maybe my eyes were overworked from staring at computer screens all day. Over the next few days, I avoided stopping in front of the mirror. I walked by quickly, always looking straight ahead. But that feeling of being watched grew stronger. Whenever I had to go down the hall at night, my heart would beat faster. I'd flip the switch on as quickly as possible. I noticed goosebumps on my arms even if the temperature was warm. Sometimes I caught myself clenching my teeth, my jaw hurting from the tension. I decided to invite a friend over, but I didn't tell him anything. I just said, "Hey, check out this old mirror I got from my uncle." He looked it over, tapped the frame, commented on how heavy it looked. He didn't mention any weird feelings or reflection lag, so I asked, "Do you see anything strange about it?" He just shrugged. "No, man, it's just an old mirror. Kinda cool, though." "Why?" I made up an excuse about thinking it might be warped or something. He helped me test angles and lighting. Nothing weird happened while he was there. After he left, I felt more unsettled than ever. I wondered if the mirror was only messing with me. A few nights later, something new happened. I was coming out of the bathroom, and the corridor was dimly lit again. I tried to keep my eyes straight, but my peripheral vision caught a flicker. I turned and saw in the reflection that my face wasn't facing forward. It was angled as though I was looking off to one side, except in real life, I was facing the mirror head-on. It happened so fast that I wasn't sure if it was real, but I felt my hands tremble. My knees felt weak. I reached for the wall to steady myself. When I looked again, my reflection matched me perfectly. I stood there, letting out shaky breaths, trying to gather my courage. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear the rush of blood in my ears. Over the next week, these incidents happened more frequently. Each time, it was brief. A shoulder moving on its own, a head turning, eyes blinking a split second slower, but always just enough to make my stomach twist. I started to dread walking through that corridor. I considered covering the mirror with a sheet. I even had the sheet in my hands one afternoon, but I paused. I felt silly. I thought maybe the fear itself was feeding my imagination. So I put the sheet away, determined to face it head-on. That lasted exactly one day. One evening I had just finished dinner. I turned off the kitchen light and walked to the hallway. I realized the house was completely silent except for the hum of the fridge. I felt like I was being watched more intensely than before. My skin tingled. I stopped midway down the corridor and forced myself to stare at the mirror. My breath felt shallow, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Nothing happened for a solid 30 seconds. But then I saw the reflection's eyes shift just a moment after mine did. I felt a jolt in my chest, and I backed up against the opposite wall. My reflection was back in sync in an instant, but I knew what I saw. I lunged for the light switch, my hands shaking. That's when I realized the hallway lights were already on. Somehow the reflection looked darker, as though there was a slight shadow on my reflection's face that wasn't on mine. I couldn't stand it anymore. I rushed to my storage closet, found a large piece of fabric, and threw it over the mirror. I barely slept that night. Every creak in the house made me jump. My chest felt tight, and my eyes kept darting around my bedroom, looking for something that wasn't there. Over the following days, I left the mirror covered. But every time I passed by that shape on the wall, I felt uneasy. It was like I could still sense something behind the cloth. I started hearing faint tapping sounds at random times. always near the hallway, especially at night. It wasn't loud, more like a gentle click or knock. I'd rush out and check, but nothing was there. The cloth remained over the mirror, and everything else looked normal. My sleep got worse. I had trouble focusing at work. I tried to talk myself into believing the mirror was just a piece of old glass. Maybe it had some mild distortion, maybe I was losing it. Eventually, I made up my mind to get rid of it, but I hesitated because it was the only thing I had from my great uncle. I also worried it might be valuable, so throwing it out felt wrong. I spent a couple days calling antique shops, asking if they'd be interested in buying a 19th century mirror. Most of them said they'd need to see pictures first. I felt a jolt of dread at the thought of removing the cloth to take pictures, but I did it anyway. In daylight, with the windows open and sunlight flooding in, the mirror looked almost normal. I used my phone to snap some photos. I stood as far away as I could, trying not to catch my reflection. Then I took a couple close-up shots of the carved frame. That's when I noticed a small mark on the wood, near the bottom corner. It looked like someone had carved a tiny symbol. It was nothing fancy, just a small X shape with a line through it. I hadn't noticed it before because it was near the edge where the wood was darkest. My stomach tightened again. I felt like I'd stumbled onto something I shouldn't have seen, but I took the photos anyway and emailed them to a local antiques dealer. He called me back the same day, asked a few questions about the mirror's condition, then offered to come by and take a look. I was relieved. Maybe I could pass the mirror on to someone else, get a little money, and be done with it. We scheduled an appointment for the weekend. The next few days I kept the cloth off, figuring if I needed to sell it, I might as well keep it uncovered. But I didn't dare walk past it at night without turning on every light in the vicinity. I stopped looking directly at it. I moved around it quickly and tried to keep my eyes on the floor. On Friday evening, I was leaving for a short walk to clear my head. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard that soft tapping again. I froze. The mirror was in my peripheral vision. I glanced at it and my mouth went dry. My reflection stood there, but I couldn't see its face clearly. It seemed like the facial features were slightly blurred, as though the glass had fogged up right at my reflection's head. I blinked rapidly, and the blurriness vanished. My reflection stared back at me, matching my stance perfectly. I swallowed hard, feeling my heart thud. I grabbed my keys, not wanting to stay in the house any longer. I left all the lights on and got out, locking the door behind me. The antiques dealer is supposed to come tomorrow morning. I'm counting down the hours. I don't care if I lose money on it. I just want that mirror out of my house. Right now, I'm sitting at my desk, writing this down because I need to get it off my chest. My hands are shaking and I keep glancing over my shoulder even though I'm locked in my bedroom. Every little noise sets me on edge. I can't wait for tomorrow. I want this thing gone. If the dealer decides not to buy it, I'll put it in my garage. If that doesn't help, I'll drag it to the curb. I just know I need to separate myself from that mirror. I don't know if there's a logical explanation or if it's just some antique with a warped glass, but I know what I felt and what I saw. Even if no one else believes me, I can't keep living with that sense of being watched. I'm done with it. Tomorrow, that mirror is leaving this house for good. If I ever see another reflection move out of sync with me, it sure as hell won't be in my own hallway. That's all I can say. I'm going to bed now, though I doubt I'll sleep much. But at least there's a plan. By this time tomorrow, I hope I'll finally feel normal again. I've been living in this apartment building for 2 years. It's nothing fancy. The corridors are dull gray, the doors are off-white, and the carpets smell like dust. But it's close to my job, and the rent isn't too bad. I never had any big problems here until a few weeks ago, when I started hearing those repeated knocks in the middle of the night. They weren't faint. They were heavy, rhythmic thuds against the wall that separates my living room from the unit next door. I remember the first time I heard it. It was around 1 a.m., and I was on my couch flipping through channels. The knocking started like someone striking a hammer against concrete. Thump, Pause, thump, pause, thump. The sound was steady. It made my heart race because I thought, who the hell is doing construction at this hour? I got up and pressed my ear to the wall. My pulse pounded in my temples. I felt a slight vibration through the dry wall each time the knock occurred. I didn't hear voices. I didn't hear any drilling. It was just this repeated pounding. I didn't want to be that person who immediately calls the landlord, so I let it go for the night, figuring it was some weird maintenance issue. But the next few nights, I heard it again. It came at random times, sometimes in the early evening, sometimes at midnight, sometimes around dawn. It never lasted more than a few minutes, but it always happened in that same rhythmic pattern. After a week of this, I knocked on my neighbor's door to complain. I'd never seen anyone come or go from that apartment. Nobody answered. I found the building's superintendent, a guy named Carlos, and I told him about the noise. He gave me a weird look and said the unit next door was empty. There were no tenants. The owner was trying to rent it out. He seemed puzzled but not overly concerned. He told me he'd check it out. A couple of days later, I still heard the noise. I told Carlos again and he shrugged. He said he had gone inside the apartment that morning and it was completely empty. No furniture, no boxes, no tools. He said he looked around and found no signs of activity. I asked if maybe the building's pipes were causing the noise, but he insisted the pipes in that wall were for water supply, not something that would create pounding. I felt uneasy. It's not that I believed in ghosts or anything. I just hated not knowing what was going on. The noise disturbed me. It made me feel like I was never alone, even when I was supposed to be. I kept the TV or music on all day just to distract myself from the quiet. Late at night, I'd lie in bed, listening, waiting to see if the knocking would start. One evening, around 10 p.m., I was sitting at my small dining table trying to finish some work on my laptop. I had the overhead light on, and the place felt stuffy. I decided to open a window. The outside air was chilly. I remember smelling wet pavement. That's when I heard the noise again. It started with a faint knock, then another, then that repetitive pounding. It didn't feel right to ignore it anymore. My skin prickled on my arms, and I felt a jolt of adrenaline. I marched to the wall and pressed my hand against it. The drywall was vibrating with each strike. I yelled, "Hey, who's there?" The knocking stopped for a second, then resumed, louder. My stomach tightened. I felt a surge of frustration and a twinge of fear. I grabbed my phone and texted Carlos, telling him the noise was happening right then. He replied almost immediately, saying he was on his way. While I waited for him, I put my ear to the wall again. The knocking continued for maybe a minute. Then there was this scraping sound like something heavy being dragged across the floor. It reminded me of the sound a wooden chair makes when someone scrapes it along a tile floor. I started shaking. I wanted to believe it was just some random intruder, but the building is secure and the apartment is supposed to be locked. I stepped away from the wall, wiped sweat off my forehead, and tried to calm down. 5 minutes later, Carlos showed up at my door with the key to the vacant unit. He looked nervous. He's an older guy, usually pretty laid back, but I saw his hand tremble a bit. I led him to my living room so he could hear the noise himself. By then, the banging had stopped. Everything was silent. I turned off my TV to make sure we didn't miss anything. Carlos said, "Let's just open it up and see." We walked out into the hallway. The corridor lights flickered, like they always do. The building never fixes them. Carlos inserted the key into the next door. I heard the lock click. My heart thumped in my chest as we entered. The apartment smelled stale, like it hadn't been aired out in a long time. The air felt cold. The floors were old vinyl, scratched from years of use. The walls had the same dull gray paint as the hallway. There was zero furniture, no boxes, no tools, nothing. I flicked the light switch near the entrance, but it didn't work. Carlos pulled out a small flashlight he kept on his keychain. Its beam was weak, but enough to guide us. We walked through the living room area. Every step echoed. There was a thick layer of dust on the floor. It felt gritty under my shoes. Carlos moved the flashlight beam across the corners of the room. I saw nothing unusual, no footprints in the dust, No signs of recent movement. We made our way into the short hallway that led to the bedrooms. One door opened into a small bedroom. Another door opened into a larger bedroom. Both were empty. The windows were locked from the inside. The place felt dead. The silence made my ears ring. Carlos and I looked at each other. He mumbled something about this being a waste of time. That's when I noticed a faint scuff mark near one wall, like something had scraped the vinyl. I bent down and ran my finger over it. The mark was fresh. The color of the vinyl was peeled in a small line. It looked like something heavy had been dragged, but it didn't continue across the room. It was just a short mark, maybe a foot long, and then it stopped. I pointed it out to Carlos. He shrugged. He said, "Could be left over from a previous tenant." I didn't argue, but in my gut I felt that wasn't right. We walked back to the living room. I checked the walls for holes or cracks, expecting maybe there was a pipe or a vent that could cause noise. The walls were intact, no sign of damage. Carlos let out a deep breath and said, "I don't know what to tell you, place is empty." We returned to my apartment. I thanked him for coming and closed the door. That night I hardly slept. I kept staring at the ceiling, waiting. Every little creak in the building made me tense. Sometime around 3 a.m., I dozed off. I didn't hear the knocking again until a few days later. That next time, it was late afternoon. Sunlight was streaming through my living room window. I was on the phone with a friend telling him about the weird noises. He made jokes about ghosts, but I could tell he found it unsettling. As we talked, I heard the first thump. I froze. The line went silent because I stopped talking mid-sentence. Then another thump, and another. Each hit was strong, like someone pounding with a heavy tool. My hand tightened around the phone. I told my friend to hold on, then I walked to the wall. The knocking kept going, consistent, almost mechanical. My heart pounded against my ribs. I couldn't just ignore it anymore. I told my friend I'd call him back. I hung up. I pressed my ear to the wall, and I heard a muffled scraping noise like metal being dragged on concrete. I felt a surge of panic, but I was determined to prove I wasn't imagining things. I ran into the hallway and knocked on the apartment door. No response. I banged louder. "Hey, I hear you in there." The knocking on the other side stopped. I felt a chill run down my neck. I took a step back. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? There was no proof of anything illegal. I decided to wait for Carlos again. But after a minute or two, the hallway stayed silent, and the noise didn't return. I went back inside my place, locked the door, and tried to calm down. That evening, around 8 p.m., I heard movement next door one more time. It was that dragging sound again, as if someone was sliding a heavy object across the floor. Then a loud bang, like something dropped. I rushed out my door and hurried to the next apartment. I banged on the door, yelling for whoever was inside to open up. Nothing. My breath was short. My hands shook. I grabbed my phone and dialed Carlos. I told him, "Come now. I think someone broke in. I hear furniture moving." He arrived within 5 minutes. We unlocked the empty apartment again. We walked inside, flicking on flashlights, scanning every corner. No sign of anyone. The dust was still on the floor. No fresh footprints, no new drag marks. Everything was exactly the same. I felt the temperature in the place was colder than usual. My arms got goosebumps. Carlos mumbled that this was beyond him. He suggested I call the building manager. We left and locked the place up. I spent that night watching TV at a low volume, waiting for the next knock. My legs bounced up and down. I chewed on my lip until it hurt. At around 11 p.m., I got an idea. I decided to keep my phone's camera ready. If I heard anything, I'd record. I left all my lights on. I sat on the couch, watching some random sitcom. My nerves were on edge. I noticed my throat felt dry, so I went to the kitchen for water. Right as I opened the fridge, the knocking started again. I grabbed my phone, sprinted to the living room, and started recording. The sound was clear. 3 heavy knocks, then a pause, then another 3. My heart hammered. I whispered into the camera mic, I'm hearing it right now. Then I heard a loud scrape, like a chair leg dragged across the floor. My breath caught in my chest. I felt a spike of fear that made my scalp tingle. The knocks continued in that pattern for maybe 10 seconds, then stopped abruptly. The video caught all of it. I played it back to confirm I hadn't imagined it. The sound was there. Now I had proof. I texted the video to Carlos and told him, "Look at this. Something's going on in there." He replied, telling me he would bring the property manager the next morning and we'd all go in together. The following morning, I met Carlos and the manager in the hallway. The manager was a tall woman with a clipboard. She looked skeptical. We opened the apartment again. Same stale smell, same silence. I showed her the video on my phone. She watched it. I could see her expression change from annoyance to concern. She said quietly, "Let's do a thorough check." We went room by room, tapping on walls, checking closets, even looking behind the water heater. There was nothing unusual. No hidden entry points, no vents big enough for someone to sneak in. But then, in the master bedroom, the manager noticed a faint rectangular outline on the wall near the floor. It looked like an old hatch or patch job that had been painted over. The edges were barely visible, but they were there. She tried to see if it moved or if it was sealed. It felt solid. Carlos tapped on it. The sound was dull, like it might be blocked by insulation. We didn't have any tools with us to pry it open, and the manager didn't want to damage the wall without a good reason. She took a picture of it with her phone and said she'd contact the owner about it. After that, we left. For a few nights, things were quiet. Then, around the end of that week, the knocking came back louder than before. It shook my wall. I felt vibrations travel through my living room floor. I jumped up, heart racing, and started recording again. My chest was tight, my breathing fast. I kept looking at my phone's screen as I captured the sound. I felt dread like I'd never felt before. It was as if someone was in there, waiting for me to react. I heard 3 more knocks, then scraping, then silence. My entire body was shaking. I didn't know what to do. The manager had said she would handle it, but clearly nothing had changed. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I sent the new recording to the manager. She replied that she had forwarded the clips to the owner. She told me they'd be having someone come in and inspect the place. That was about a week ago. Since then, I've heard the knocking a few more times, but I haven't gone back in there. I lock my door. I keep my phone by my side. My anxiety is through the roof. Every time the building creaks, I jump. Every time I see Carlos, I ask if there's an update. He just shakes his head, saying the owner's taking their time. I've considered moving out. The idea of living next to a place that has these unexplainable noises, with no furniture, no signs of life, and yet these constant knocking sounds, it rattles me. I'm on edge every night. I feel a rush of adrenaline whenever the sun goes down. The manager told me to hang tight. She said they'll figure it out. She told me they found no evidence of squatters or break-ins. They changed the locks just to be safe. None of that made a difference. The sound still happens. No one believes there's a simple explanation anymore, but no one can explain it at all. Now, I try to avoid my living room at night. I stay in my bedroom with music on, so I don't have to hear the faint thuds through the wall. Sometimes I sit there holding my breath, straining my ears to see if it's starting up again. My shoulders stay tense. My stomach twists in knots. I just want it to end. Carlos has promised to help me talk to the owner again if it keeps up. That's all I've got. I'm not hearing things. I'm not imagining it. I have the recordings. I have the scuff marks. I have the chills every time I step near that wall. I don't know how long I can handle this, but for now I'm stuck. The apartment next door remains empty. The landlord still lists it as available, but nobody seems interested. Every time a prospective renter visits, they walk around, comment on how it's a bit dated, and then leave. I think they sense something's off. Maybe they pick up on the weird silence. Maybe they notice the slight chill in the air. I keep hoping one day I'll come home and see new neighbors moving in, real people with boxes and furniture, ready to fill that space with normal, everyday sounds. At least that would give me some kind of reassurance that I'm not trapped next to something I can't understand. Until then, I'm here, waiting for the next knock. I don't feel safe, but I don't know what else to do. Every night I sit on my couch, watch TV, and pretend the wall isn't there. But deep down I wait for that thump, and when it comes I freeze. My mouth goes dry, my heart beats faster, and I can't shake the feeling that something is right on the other side, pounding for attention. The fact that nobody can explain it just makes it worse. It's not a ghost story or some urban legend. It's real, and it's here, a few feet from my living room. That's the part that keeps me up at night, and I'm just hoping one day I'll hear silence for good, or find a new place and never look back. For now, I'm stuck with the knocking in the empty apartment, and I'm not sure which will break first, the wall or my nerves. I first heard the rumors during my second month at the company. A co-worker mentioned a strange figure on the rooftop terrace. He said he saw it from the window in the break room upstairs. I figured it was a person from maintenance, or maybe security checking the outer walls. But stories kept circulating and people said the door to that terrace was always locked. They said the only way up there was through the old service stairs in the back hallway. The management didn't allow anyone to use those stairs. They said it was for emergency or maintenance only. The more I heard, the more I wondered if my co-workers were exaggerating. Sometimes offices have weird rumors. I didn't pay much attention in the beginning. The building has more than 30 floors with a standard lobby and multiple elevator banks. My office is on the 25th floor. We have a main corridor with a few side hallways that lead to storage rooms, restrooms, and an old freight elevator that's out of service. On the other side of that freight elevator, there's a gray metal door leading to the service stairwell. That door is always locked. You need a special key card to open it, and only maintenance or security personnel have access. The terrace is all the way at the top. Technically, there's a mechanical room and then the roof. People call it a terrace, but it's really just a flat rooftop area with some equipment. A few of my colleagues claimed they sometimes saw a dark shape on the edge of the roof when they looked through the break room window. One guy swore it stood right at the corner, still and silent, usually after normal work hours. Another guy joked that it was a ghost or something, but nobody could confirm who or what it was. The door remained locked, the elevator to the roof was disabled, and nobody ever reported missing keys. At least that's what the facility manager said. I spent a couple of months shrugging it off. I had my own tasks to handle. I worked on a big project and often stayed late. That's when things started getting strange for me. One night I worked on some spreadsheets until around 9 p.m. The office was mostly empty. I could hear the cleaning staff vacuuming on a lower floor. I was tired and hungry. I went to the corridor near the freight elevator because it had a window with a good view of the city lights. I liked to step out of my office space to get some air. I smoked back then, but the building had strict rules, so I'd try to do it near an open window if possible, even though it wasn't exactly allowed. I leaned against the window ledge, looked up, and saw something on the highest edge of the building. It looked like a person. It was just a dark outline against the night sky. My heart thumped hard because I remembered the stories. I squinted, tried to see more details, but it was too dark. The shape wasn't moving, at least as far as I could tell. I got a weird feeling in my stomach. My palms got sweaty and I felt my chest tighten. I wanted to confirm if it was a person, so I shifted positions. I backed away a bit and then looked again, but the shape remained there. It looked like a human figure standing right at the edge of the roof. I decided to find someone else. I didn't want to stand there alone, staring. I felt nervous, and my mind raced with questions. I ran toward the security desk in the lobby on my floor. Nobody was there because the main security posts were in the ground floor lobby and the sub-basement. So I took the elevator down to the ground floor. I told the security guard at the main desk that I saw someone standing on the roof. He looked at me like I was messing with him, but I insisted. I said we should check it out right away. He called one of his colleagues, and they agreed to accompany me back up to my floor. When we got back to the corridor window, the shape was gone. The guard looked around, scanned the windows, and said maybe it was just a trick of the light. I told him it wasn't. I was sure I saw a person. He decided we should see if the service stairway door was opened or tampered with. We went to that gray metal door. It was still locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. We tried the door handle, but it didn't budge. The guard used his key card, and we walked up several flights of stairs until we got to the top. That door was also locked. He opened it with another key card. We stepped onto the roof. The wind hit me, and I shivered a bit. The guard's flashlight swept over the concrete surface. We didn't see anyone. No footprints, no tools, no sign of a person. Nothing was out of place. We stood there for a couple of minutes, listening. All I heard was the wind and a faint hum from the nearby air handling units. The guard sighed and said, "Looks empty. We gotta go back." I felt unsettled. I couldn't shake the idea that someone had been there. We locked everything again, and I left the building soon after. That night, I slept badly. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that motionless figure up on the roof, staring down at me. Over the next few days, I asked a couple of coworkers if they'd seen the silhouette again. One guy said yes, but only from the break room window. He didn't bother reporting it because he figured it was just maintenance. The facility manager told me maintenance never goes up there at night unless there's an emergency. He had no open tickets for that week. He told me to focus on my job and not worry about it. That attitude annoyed me, but I let it go. A week later, I worked late again. I couldn't avoid it because we had a project deadline. I felt jittery, but I also felt curious. I went to the corridor window around 8:30 p.m. I scanned the rooftop. It was empty. Relief washed over me, and I told myself maybe I had been seeing things. I turned my back on the window, and right then something made me glance up again. It was there. The silhouette stood on the corner, the same spot, just as still as before. I froze. My hands started shaking. My scalp felt prickly. I wanted to check if maybe I was seeing a trick of the reflection, so I moved from side to side. The shape remained there, as though it was actually on the edge. There was no movement. I couldn't see details like clothing or facial features. It was just an outline. I grabbed my phone and tried to zoom in with the camera, but when I tried to snap a photo, the figure vanished. It didn't fade or walk away. It was just gone in the blink of an eye. I stared for several seconds, blinking, trying to make sense of it. My heart was pounding like crazy. I walked down to the security desk in the lobby again. I recognized the guard from the previous time. He shook his head and said he didn't see anything on the monitors. The cameras don't show the rooftop edge as well, just the entrance to the mechanical room doors. He asked if I wanted to go up with him again, but I told him it was probably pointless if it disappeared that quickly. He nodded, but he looked uneasy. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was some trick caused by the reflection of lights from neighboring buildings. Maybe I was tired. But a couple of days later, 2 more colleagues said they saw the same silhouette. One of them was sure it was a person. He even thought it might be some sort of intruder. The other said it didn't look human because it never moved. It just stood there like a statue. I decided to talk to the maintenance supervisor. He was a serious man, always direct. I asked if he or any of his crew ever went up to the roof at night. He said no, not unless they had an emergency, which they rarely did. I asked about old equipment or mannequins stored up there. He gave me a puzzled look and said, "There's nothing up there but vents, pipes, and an AC unit." I asked if maybe a large piece of debris could have been stuck on the edge. He said that was impossible. The wind up there would blow anything away. I thanked him, but I walked away with more questions. Each new sighting made my nerves worse. I started feeling a pit in my stomach whenever I had to stay late. I hated going near that window, but I also felt drawn to it. One evening, around 7:45 p.m., I was the only person left in my department. I left my desk to stretch my legs and ended up in that corridor again. I stared at the rooftop. It was empty for a few minutes. I was about to leave, but then I saw it appear. There was no gradual movement. 1 second it wasn't there, and the next second it was. I dropped my pen. I could hear my breathing get shallow. My skin felt cold. I stood there, paralyzed, not sure if I should look away or keep watching. The figure stayed in place. I felt an urge to yell or do something, but I kept quiet. My mind was buzzing with tension. I slowly lifted my phone, tried to film it, but the screen showed nothing. When I looked up from the phone, the figure was gone again. I let out a shaky breath. My legs felt weak. I hurried back to my desk, packed my things, and left for the night. In the elevator, I couldn't stop staring at the floor number display. I kept thinking about that thing. Maybe it was a person. Maybe it was some bizarre reflection. But how could a reflection appear and disappear like that? The next day, I mentioned it to a friend in our IT department. He'd heard the rumors too. We agreed to check security footage from the top floors. We snuck into an unused conference room where he had access to some internal feeds. We scanned through the cameras. We saw empty hallways, empty mechanical rooms. We saw the door to the roof, but it never opened during the times I saw the silhouette. There was no sign of anyone going up or down the service stairwell. We spent an hour looking at different angles. Nothing. We left that room feeling frustrated. My anxiety grew every time I had to stay late. A couple of nights later, I left work around 8 p.m. I purposely avoided the corridor window. But as I stood waiting for the elevator, I felt compelled to peek around the corner. I told myself it was just a quick glance. I leaned forward. The shape was there, in the same corner of the roof. My chest tightened. I slowly moved back, like I didn't want it to see me. I had no idea if it could see me, but that thought freaked me out. I kept imagining a pair of eyes staring down at me. I got on the elevator, pressed the button for the ground floor, and waited. The ride felt slow. My ears were ringing. I felt sweat trickling down my back. I just wanted to get out of the building. When I reached the lobby, I saw a security guard. I told him I was leaving and he nodded. I didn't mention the silhouette again. I wasn't sure what else they could do. Over the next few weeks, I heard the rumors get more intense. More people claimed to see the figure. Some tried to take pictures, but nobody got anything clear. A few saw only a glimpse, like a shape at the corner of their vision. Others saw it stand there for a minute or two. A lot of people made jokes about it. They said it was some bored security person, or a weird reflection. A few seemed genuinely disturbed. One coworker told me he felt like he was being watched from above when he walked to the break room at night. I still had to stay late occasionally, but I did everything I could to avoid the windows. I started bringing my own coffee in a thermos, so I wouldn't have to go to the break room after hours. I also moved my desk so I couldn't see the corridor from where I sat. It felt like I was letting some unknown thing control my behavior, but I didn't know how else to cope. I hated that feeling of dread. I knew other people felt it too. One Friday, I finished my work around 7:30 p.m. Most of the office was empty, since people tend to leave early on Fridays. I passed by the corridor and stopped. Part of me wanted to look out the window again. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that there was a logical explanation. Maybe I hoped I wouldn't see anything. I walked to the window. I could see the top of the building. My mouth felt dry. My fingertips tingled. For a moment, there was nothing. Then the silhouette popped into view. My heart felt like it skipped a beat. It stood on the ledge, motionless. I watched it for several seconds, forcing myself to breathe slowly. I whispered something under my breath, just a confused word or two. No movement. It was like a person wearing dark clothing, but I couldn't see any details. Then, as I tried to shift my stance, it vanished. I backed away from the window and looked around, hoping to see someone in the hallway, but it was silent and empty. My legs felt shaky. I muttered, "I'm done," grabbed my stuff, and left. I didn't even say bye to the security guard. I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel, feeling my pulse in my ears. At this point, nobody had found a logical reason. The building management claimed everything was secure. The security team had no proof of any intruder. Maintenance had no unusual activity. yet people kept seeing that silhouette. I never discovered who or what it was. I just know what I saw. It was there, on the edge of the roof, in a place that should have been empty. And every time we tried to check, it disappeared. After a while, I stopped working late alone. I found ways to leave earlier or do extra work at home. I didn't want to be in that corridor by myself. I still see the silhouette in my mind sometimes. I think about how it stood there without moving, right on the edge, and how there was no sign of forced entry or open doors. I can't explain it. Maybe it was a person who had some way to sneak up there. Maybe it was something else. All I know is that the sight of that shape, dark and silent against the night sky, sent waves of fear through me like nothing else ever has. And the strangest part is how real it all felt, even though I never found a single shred of evidence to confirm it. It just kept appearing, and then it would be gone, as if it was never there at all. I still remember the first night I noticed something in the stockroom. I was wrapping up a sales report at my desk when I caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection on the glass door. I froze with my eyes on that glass, wondering if I was seeing things. The shape looked like a person. It passed between the shelves just for a second, before disappearing into the darkness. It felt like a punch in the gut. My hands were tense. My breathing got shallow. It was late. I was alone, and nobody should be moving around back there. I told myself it was a trick of the light, or maybe just my tired eyes. But it didn't stop me from staring at that reflection for the rest of the night. My name is Daniel. I work at a supply company that stocks office essentials and hardware items. Our building is pretty standard. There's a front office area where most of the desks and computers are, a small break room, a couple of bathrooms, and a large storage area in the back. During the day, it's well lit, busy, and kind of loud with people moving pallets, opening boxes, and restocking shelves. But at night, the company tries to save money on electricity, so they turn off the warehouse lights unless there's a scheduled inventory check. Usually, by 6 or 7 p.m., everyone heads home, and the stockroom stays dark until morning. I often stay late because I handle a lot of the end-of-day reports. I'm not a supervisor, but my boss relies on me to handle certain tasks that require concentration and time without interruptions. That means I'm often alone in the building after everyone else has gone. I never minded it before. I liked the quiet. I could hear the hum of the air conditioner, the faint buzz of the lights above my desk, and the distant traffic outside. It gave me a sense of peace to work at my own pace without coworkers asking questions or phones ringing. But after that first time I saw something in the stockroom reflection, everything changed. It was subtle at first. I'd just feel nervous as the hours dragged on. I'd keep looking at the clock on my computer screen, telling myself I'd leave in half an hour, but then I'd get caught up in one last email or one last sheet to fill out. The entire time, I'd catch myself glancing at the glass door that led to the stock area. I'd see nothing but the darkness behind it, or maybe my own reflection. Yet sometimes I'd notice a slight shape shifting around. Then I'd blink, and it would be gone. For a while, I tried to shrug it off. It's easy to see things when you're tired, and my workload is heavier than most. I have eye strain from staring at spreadsheets for hours. I also drink a lot of coffee, which makes me jittery, so I told myself it was all in my head. But then came that night when I actually opened the door to check. It was around 8 p.m., maybe a bit later. The office was silent except for the low hum from my computer's fan. I was finalizing a monthly inventory report. I had about 3 pages to go. Then I saw a definite movement in the reflection. It wasn't random, it moved from left to right like a person walking behind the rows of shelves. This time I didn't hesitate. I stood up quickly, grabbed my phone, and marched to the door. I opened it fast and shone the phone's flashlight into the warehouse. I heard a scuffling sound like something scraping against concrete. My heart pounded in my ears. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" No one answered. The shelves were tall. There were boxes stacked in rows that reached well above my head. The overhead lights were off, so everything was mostly shadows. I only had my phone's light, which created a narrow beam. My mouth felt dry. I took a step inside. I walked down one of the aisles, aiming my light at every corner. I saw cardboard boxes, stacks of paper, cleaning supplies, and pallets. I passed one row of shelving, turned the corner, and aimed my light behind a cluster of boxes. Nothing. No sign of a person, no sign of movement. It was dead silent except for the faint creak of something settling. I checked behind the larger crates but saw nothing unusual. Everything was in its place. The stock was well organized, and I knew from memory how it was supposed to look. Suddenly, I heard a slight thud a couple of shelves behind me. I jerked around and aimed my phone's light there. Again, no one. My heart felt like it was going to blow out of my chest. I'm not an athlete, but I was ready to sprint if I saw something. I called out again, "Hey, if someone's messing around, you need to cut it out." My voice echoed a bit through the racks, but there was no response. Eventually, I left the warehouse, double-checked the door behind me, and went back to my desk. I couldn't concentrate after that. My hands were still shaky. My eyes kept flicking to the door, expecting another glimpse of that figure. I tried to finish my work, but my body was on edge. Every small noise, from the air vents to the creaks of the building settling, made me jump. After another 15 minutes, I gave up and closed my laptop. I left the office in a hurry, making sure all lights except my desk lamp were off, and locked the front door behind me. My mind wouldn't stop racing on the drive home. I kept imagining someone crouching behind the boxes, waiting until I left. The next day, I talked to my boss, Mike, in a casual way. I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I phrased it like a security concern. I said, "Hey Mike, I heard some noises in the stockroom last night. I thought I saw someone. Is there any chance someone else has a key, or maybe a side entrance was left open?" He looked at me like I was a bit off. He insisted that nobody had access after hours except me, him, and the cleaning crew. And the cleaning crew leaves around 6. He said there's one side door that leads to a small loading dock, but it's always locked from the outside. He seemed calm, so I tried not to make a big deal out of it. Deep down, though, I was worried. I still had to stay late that day. My workload didn't disappear because I was spooked. So around 7:30 p.m., I was the last one in the building again. This time I turned on a couple of extra lights in the hallway leading to the warehouse door. I didn't open the door, but I stood near it a few times, just listening. The building was quiet. I heard nothing except the occasional squeak from the ventilation system. My eyes kept darting to the door's glass panel. I felt a tightness in my chest every time I saw my own reflection, but I didn't see anything else moving around in there that night. I left around 8:30 p.m., relieved that it was quiet. Over the next couple of weeks, the sightings became more frequent in small ways. Sometimes I'd just catch a quick movement in the glass. Other times I'd hear a faint noise like something shifting. It was never loud enough to be certain. One evening, I heard a soft tapping coming from inside the warehouse. It lasted maybe 10 seconds. I stood there, phone in hand, debating whether to check it out or ignore it. My heart pounded. My palms got sweaty. I decided to ignore it because I didn't want to confront whatever was back there alone. About 10 minutes later, the tapping stopped. I tried to focus on my spreadsheet, but my nerves were shot. I started making small changes to my routine. I'd crank up some music on my headphones, hoping that blocking out any weird sounds would help me stay calm. Or I'd step outside to take a phone call just to clear my head. But every time I came back in, I felt watched. It was like an itching feeling on the back of my neck. I'd glance at the door, and sometimes I'd swear I saw a shape, a silhouette slipping behind a shelf. It was always out of the corner of my eye. My sleep started to suffer. I'd get home and replay the events of the night in my head. The darkness, the rustling, that shape in the reflection. I'd wonder if someone was living in the warehouse. Maybe a homeless person sneaked in and was hiding behind boxes. Or maybe a coworker was playing a prank. But I couldn't figure out why anyone would keep doing it for so long. And I never found any real evidence. No missing items, no footprints or trash left behind. No sign that someone was actually staying there. One night, I decided to do a thorough search early on, while I still had some daylight. It was around 6 p.m., and the sun was just setting. I turned on all the warehouse lights. The large fluorescent tubes blinked on, flooding the area with that cold, harsh light. I walked every aisle, checking each shelf, looking for places someone might hide. I moved a few piles of boxes. I checked the corners behind the pallets. I even opened a few sealed boxes just in case. Everything was in order. The stock matched the inventory list. There were no unexpected items or signs of squatters. After almost an hour, I was convinced no one was there. I locked the stockroom door, turned off the main lights, and went back to my desk. Around 7:30 p.m., I was finishing a phone call with a supplier. I had the warehouse door in my peripheral vision. The overhead office lights were still on. Then I saw it. A dark figure, tall, human-shaped, moved past the glass. It was slow, not rushing, like it was just walking by. My heart hammered so hard I thought I'd pass out. I ended the call abruptly, saying I had to go. I grabbed my phone again, turned the flashlight on, and ran to the door. I yanked it open and shone the light. Silence. Just the rows of boxes and shelves. No one in sight. I stepped inside, scanning every aisle with the flashlight beam. My breaths were shaky. I felt a chill on the back of my neck. The warehouse smelled stale, like cardboard and metal racks. I didn't hear a single footstep or shuffle. Everything was still. It felt like the place itself was holding its breath. After a few minutes, I backed out slowly, my hand trembling on the doorknob. I shut the door and locked it. Things escalated a few days later. I was punching in the numbers for a bulk order we'd received that afternoon. It was getting late. The rest of the office staff was gone. I heard a scraping sound from inside the warehouse, like a large box being dragged across the floor. It was much louder than the small rustles or taps I'd heard before. My heart jumped into my throat. I stood up so fast my chair almost tipped over. I grabbed a metal flashlight we kept in a drawer by the front desk, bigger and brighter than my phone's light, and slowly walked to the warehouse door. I opened it just a crack. The scraping sound stopped. I pushed the door fully open and shone the flashlight inside. I caught a glimpse of a stack of boxes tipping slightly. Then everything was quiet. My mind raced. I stepped closer, one slow foot at a time. The flashlight illuminated patches of concrete and cardboard. I heard my own breathing and the distant buzz of an exit sign. I made it to the stack of boxes and saw that one had moved about a foot from where it usually sat. It was a heavy box of printer paper, so it couldn't have just slid on its own. I felt a wave of dread. I aimed the flashlight around the rest of that aisle. Empty. I kept moving through the next aisle and the next. Each step echoed in the silence. I checked behind every major stack and didn't find a single person. At that moment, I felt completely alone, yet my skin crawled like someone was standing right behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight at empty space. My pulse raced. I realized I was holding my breath. I forced myself to breathe normally, but each breath was shaky. I crept back to the door, never turning my back to the aisles, and stepped into the office. Then I locked the door again. I didn't stay any longer that night. I grabbed my stuff, shut down my computer, and left in a hurry. I felt stupid for even thinking about finishing my work. My brain wasn't in the right place. I couldn't ignore how spooked I was. I drove home with my hands clenched on the steering wheel, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds like something might have followed me. Over the next days, I struggled with anxiety about going back. I started pushing some of my tasks earlier in the day so I wouldn't need to stay late. But sometimes it was unavoidable. If I had to stay, I'd try to wrap up by 7 p.m. I kept my flashlight close and the warehouse door locked. Still, the sense of unease was overwhelming. Every time I heard a thud, a click, or even the wind blowing outside, I felt a surge of adrenaline. The final straw was last week. I was putting together an urgent report for Mike. It was around 7:15 p.m., and I was the only one there. The cleaning crew had left. My desk lamp was on, and the overhead lights were off in the rest of the office. Suddenly, I heard footsteps in the warehouse. Steady, slow footsteps on the concrete floor. They lasted about 5 or 6 steps, then stopped. It wasn't a random creak or tap. It sounded like a person walking. My spine went rigid, my scalp tingled. I grabbed my phone and approached the door. The footsteps started again, moving away from the door. I heard them echo down the main aisle. Then they faded into silence. I didn't open the door. I turned around, logged off my computer, and left. I had no interest in checking the warehouse anymore. I didn't want to find out who or what was in there. I just wanted to get the hell away. My chest felt tight and my breaths were shallow. My hands were still shaking when I got in my car. Now I'm at a point where I can't relax when I'm alone at the office. The shadows in that warehouse feel alive. I still don't have a rational explanation. Maybe it's just an intruder with a key. Maybe someone found a hidden corner to hide in. But I can't prove it. I can't catch them in the act. And every time I try, the warehouse is empty. I haven't told many people about it beyond Mike because I don't want to sound crazy, but I see it in my boss's face. He's starting to wonder if I'm a little too jumpy. He jokes about how I should cut down on the coffee, but I see the doubt in his eyes. He knows something's off, but he can't figure it out either. All I know is I hate staying late now. My gut knots up when everyone else leaves, and I'm the only one left. I keep picturing that shape moving in the dark between the shelves, slipping behind boxes. The memory of those footsteps echoes in my head. I feel sweat on my palms just thinking about it. I've never experienced anything like this before, and it's wearing me down. I'm not sure what my next step will be. Maybe I'll ask Mike to install some cameras in the warehouse to catch whoever's there. Or maybe I'll switch positions so I won't have to stay after hours. All I know is I can't keep working late in that building and pretending it's normal. Something's in there, and it's not going away. And the longer it goes on, the harder it is for me to stay calm. Every time I see that shape in the corner of my eye, my body reacts like I'm in danger. I don't sleep well. I jump at every small noise, and I dread the moment the office empties out at the end of the day. It's draining me. I just hope that sooner or later, we figure out what's really happening back there. Because if I have to keep waiting alone, staring at that dark doorway, hearing those footsteps, or seeing that shadow move around, I don't think I'll last in this job much longer. For now, I double-check all the locks, keep my phone in my hand, and try to finish as fast as possible. But I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me every time I turn my back on that stockroom door. And that's enough to make me question every sound, every flicker, every minute I spend alone in that place. I never thought a simple recording session could shake me up like that. When I first walked into that warehouse, I felt like I'd found the perfect place to lay down tracks at any hour. It was far from homes, surrounded by an empty lot, and nobody complained if I cranked the volume. I was excited about the setup: concrete floors, tall walls, enough room to set up any gear I wanted. But I didn't realize that something else lurked in the silence, something that made me question my own senses. Now every time I close my eyes, I remember that faint whisper I heard on my last night there. I still feel a knot in my gut when I think about it. I got the offer for that space from a guy who worked in live events. He told me he sometimes rented the back area to local bands or session musicians who needed a rehearsal spot. He said the place was old but functional. I walked in the first time on a Saturday afternoon. There was dust everywhere, but I didn't mind. I saw large windows high up on the walls, most of them cracked but still holding together. The concrete looked rough and the corners smelled musty. There were some wooden pallets stacked by the entrance and a single metal door that led to a narrow corridor. At the end of that corridor, there was a small office area. That's where I set up my makeshift control room. The rest of the main floor served as my live room. The old overhead lights flickered sometimes, but the power outlets worked fine. That was enough for me. I brought in my computer, audio interface, monitors, microphones, cables, and stands. I spent most of a Sunday setting it all up, checking the gear and making sure the acoustics were workable. It wasn't perfect, but with some acoustic foam on the walls, I figured it would do. I didn't notice anything strange at first. The warehouse felt empty, almost comforting because there was nothing around to distract me. I tested a few microphones, played some guitar, and listened back. Everything sounded normal. The place had a natural reverb that I kind of liked. Over the next few evenings, I started tracking some new material. I'd get in around 10 p.m. and stay until 2 or 3 in the morning. I liked working late because the world outside was quiet. I could focus on layering guitar parts, tweaking mixes, and experimenting with effects. On the second night, I was recording a vocal line when I heard a faint hiss in my headphones. It sounded like a soft wind blowing across the mic. At first, I assumed I'd bumped the pop filter or maybe there was a draft from the door. I paused, went to the door, and checked if it was open. It was closed tight. I thought maybe the big garage-style entrance on the other side of the warehouse was letting in a breeze, but it was locked. The hiss didn't appear on every take, so I shrugged it off and kept going. On the third night, that hiss showed up again. It sounded like a gentle whoosh, almost like someone blowing into the microphone. I felt a tingle on the back of my neck, but I tried to push it aside. I switched mics, changed cables, and tried different channels on my interface. The problem didn't go away. I ran a test recording, letting the mic sit there in silence while I stood still. I could hear it creeping in again after a few seconds. It faded in and out. It was subtle, but I could see it on the level meter. A tiny spike every now and then. I scoured the place looking for any open vents or something that might be causing interference. Nothing seemed to explain it. The next night, I arrived around my usual time, set up my guitar, and began recording some riffs. Everything was normal until around 1 a.m. Then that hiss came back, a little more pronounced. It started to get under my skin. I remember feeling my heart rate pick up. My forehead felt warm, even though the warehouse was kind of chilly. I stopped playing and listened carefully through the headphones. For a moment, I thought I heard a slight crackle, like static. Then it went away. I realized I was gripping my guitar so tightly that my knuckles hurt. I took a deep breath, rolled my shoulders, and tried to move on. A few days passed. I came in every night and worked on different tracks. The hiss never went away completely, but it seemed random. Some nights I barely noticed it, other nights it was more obvious. One night I tried recording percussion. When I played back one of the tracks, I heard a faint noise in the background, like someone letting out a slow exhale right after the last drum hit. I soloed the track, turned up the volume, and heard that same eerie sound. My skin prickled. I asked myself if I was imagining it. I walked around the warehouse again, checking corners, looking behind crates and old equipment. I found nothing. I started to dread that moment every night when the hiss would show up. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some electrical interference. Maybe the warehouse's old wiring messed with my setup. The next day, I bought a new power conditioner and tested everything. I swapped out every cable I owned, tried different microphones. I even brought a spare interface that belonged to a friend just to see if it was my gear. The strange noise never left. One Friday night, I was determined to figure it out. I arrived earlier than usual, around 8 p.m. I decided to record some ambient sounds in the main area. I set up a mic, hit record, and walked away, leaving it alone in the middle of the floor. I stood outside for a couple of minutes, then I came back in. I checked the recording. At first, it was just silence plus a bit of room tone. Then, out of nowhere, came a subtle crackle and a low hum that turned into that same windy hiss. My stomach churned. I felt my palms get sweaty. The hair on my arms stood up, like I was stepping into a cold draft, but I didn't feel any actual breeze. I felt uneasy, like someone was watching me. That night, I stayed until about 2 a.m. I was exhausted, but I couldn't sleep. My eyes burned from staring at waveforms on the screen, trying to locate that hiss. It felt like a losing battle, and I started packing up. While wrapping up a cable, I realized I was holding my breath. My ears were straining as if I expected to hear something behind me. I finally let out a shaky exhale and forced myself to leave. Over the weekend, I avoided the place. I told myself I needed a break. On Monday, I went back. more determined than ever to finish my recordings. I remember feeling a tightness in my chest when I stepped inside. The air smelled stale, like an old basement. I turned on the lights and booted up my gear. I told myself I'd work only until midnight. Around 11:30, I was laying down a guitar track when I heard something new in my headphones. It wasn't just a hiss. It was like a whisper, so soft I could barely make it out. I froze. My skin felt clammy. My mouth went dry. I pulled off my headphones and looked around. The warehouse was still. I rubbed the back of my neck and let out a nervous chuckle, telling myself I was hallucinating. I put the headphones back on and listened again. At first, there was only silence. Then very faintly I caught what sounded like muffled words. I couldn't make out any specific syllables, but it had a rhythm, like someone talking under their breath. My heart pounded. I paused the recording and played it back. The noise was there, but too buried to identify. I felt a wave of adrenaline surge through my body. My hands trembled. I looked at the time and decided to call it a night. I shut down my computer, powered off the monitors, and left in a hurry. The next morning, I told a friend about it. He laughed and said I was probably just tired. I half believed him, but a part of me was sure I'd heard a quiet voice. On Wednesday, I returned for what ended up being my last night in that warehouse. I arrived around 9 p.m., hoping to get done early. The place felt colder than usual, though the summer heat outside was intense. I set up everything and started recording some vocal ideas. The hiss came back within the first hour. I tried to ignore it. Then around midnight, I began hearing that low whisper again. My throat felt tight. My legs felt unsteady. I forced myself to keep tracking. I knew I couldn't ignore it, but I wanted to finish. After a few minutes, the whisper grew louder, as if it was right next to my ear. My eyes darted around the room, but it looked empty. The overhead lights buzzed softly. The corridors were dark except for the small lamp in the office area. I felt like I was suffocating. I stopped recording and took off my headphones, but the whisper didn't vanish. I could hear it through the monitors now, even though I'd paused the session. It was a constant, low murmur, like a conversation happening behind a wall. My heart hammered in my chest. I stood up, sweat rolling down my temples. I felt a small chill on my arms. I walked to the corridor, flicked on the lights, and checked every corner. There was no one. The door at the far end was locked from the inside. I checked it twice. When I got back to the main room, the murmur was still there. It was almost rhythmic, pausing for a second, then continuing. I considered the possibility of picking up a radio station or some weird interference, but it didn't sound like a broadcast. It sounded closer, more immediate. I glanced at the clock. It was close to 1 a.m. I remember feeling a surge of panic, like I couldn't stand being in that place for another minute. I walked to my desk and began shutting down my computer. My hands shook so badly that I dropped my mouse. I cursed under my breath, tried to gather my cables. The monitors still played that faint murmur. I couldn't make out any words, but it felt like speech, like someone in the next room whispering in a strained voice. Every time I thought about ignoring it, a new wave of dread hit me. My shoulders felt tense. My scalp tingled. I kept looking over my shoulder, worried I'd see someone standing there. But the warehouse was empty. The overhead lights flickered once, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I yanked the power cords out of my equipment. One of the monitors popped when I switched it off, and for a split second, the murmur got louder in my left ear. I slammed that monitor off and grabbed my keys. Before leaving, I stopped in the corridor. I felt compelled to check the door one last time, maybe to reassure myself. I pushed the door open, peered outside. The lot was still. A single streetlight glowed in the distance, illuminating a patch of concrete. No cars passed by. There was no movement anywhere, just the chirping of some bugs. I turned back and the warehouse interior looked dark. A dim emergency light by the exit cast shadows across the floor. I could still feel the tension in my chest, like a weight pressing on me. I didn't hear the whisper anymore, but I felt no relief. I flipped off the corridor light and headed out. My legs felt wobbly as I made my way to my car. The whole time I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting something to appear. Nothing did. Once inside my car, I locked the doors and started the engine. My hands were sweating. I wiped them on my jeans and finally pulled away. I drove home with the windows down, trying to calm my breathing. I kept replaying that sound in my mind, trying to convince myself it was just a glitch, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling it was something else. After that night, I never went back. I told the guy I wouldn't need the space anymore. He looked surprised but didn't ask many questions. I guess he's used to people dropping out for random reasons. I never figured out what caused the hiss, the crackle, or that whispered murmur. Some people told me it was probably radio interference or maybe just my imagination. All I know is I've recorded in basements, garages, and attics, and I've never heard anything like that before. Even now, when I plug in my gear at home, I feel a rush of relief that I don't hear that hiss. I still think about that last night, about the tension in my body and the way my heart pounded. I hate that I have no explanation. Part of me wants to go back and investigate, but I can't make myself do it. I'm not sure I want to know the truth. That's the whole story. I haven't told many people because some don't believe it, but I know what I heard. It wasn't a normal sound. It felt personal, like someone or something was trying to speak. Maybe there was something wrong with the building's wiring or acoustics, or maybe there's something else I'm better off not understanding. Either way, I'm not stepping foot in that place again. I learned that sometimes it's best to walk away when you hear a whisper that doesn't belong. I still remember the jolt in my chest when I opened the door to that meeting room. It wasn't supposed to be cold in there, but the moment I stepped inside, I felt the air hit my face like a sudden drop in temperature. My eyes swept across the long table, the projector screen, and the row of rolling chairs. The air conditioning panel on the wall showed it was off, but the cold was unmistakable. It felt like I had just walked into a freezer. I thought maybe there was some malfunction in the ventilation system. I had no clue what I was in for that night. I work in a pretty large office with multiple floors and lots of meeting rooms. It's the kind of place where you see people in suits rushing to conferences, big windows letting in too much sunlight during the day, and quiet corridors after 7 p.m. That night, I was there way past my usual time. I had a big presentation due the next morning, and I wanted to make sure everything was set up correctly. The rest of my team had already gone home. The cleaning crew usually came in around 9 p.m., but by midnight, even they were gone. As far as I knew, I was the only person left on the entire floor. I had been checking the slides on my computer at my desk, making quick edits, adjusting some fonts, and double-checking data. I decided it would be smart to go into one of the meeting rooms to test the projector. That's when I ended up in room 403, or maybe it was 404. I'm not good with the room numbers. Anyway, it was one of the smaller conference rooms with 10 or 12 chairs around a rectangular table. I remember glancing at my watch, 12:37 a.m. At first, I thought the chill was just in my head. Sometimes offices keep the AC on a low setting even at night. I went straight to the control panel on the wall. It was definitely set to off. No fans were running and there was no humming sound from any vents. I walked around the table, stood near the projector, and looked for the power button. My plan was to connect my laptop and run through the slides. Simple. Then I noticed my breath didn't show up in the air, so it wasn't that cold. It was just an uncomfortable, penetrating chill. I pulled out the VGA cable, connected it to my laptop, and turned on the projector. It whirred to life, and the screen lit up with my title slide. I was pleased to see the graphics were aligned correctly. So far, so good. I remember leaning down to grab my notes. I had a few bullet points scribbled on a notepad, mostly last-minute reminders. Then I felt it. A sudden light pressure on my right shoulder. It was cold. Not just a little cold, more like when you press a piece of ice against your skin. My heart skipped a beat. I stood upright and looked over my shoulder, but the room was empty. There were these large windows behind me. They faced another building, so there wasn't much of a view at that hour. The blinds were half down and I could see my own reflection in the glass under the fluorescent lighting. Nobody else was in the reflection. I turned around, scanned the corners of the room, and even opened the door to peek into the hallway. Nothing. Not a single person in sight. My first thought was that maybe someone I knew was playing a prank on me, but I was certain the door had been closed, and I never heard it open. The moment made my skin crawl. I told myself I was just tired. Sometimes when I work late, my mind plays tricks on me. Maybe a draft from somewhere hit my neck, and I just interpreted it as a touch. I tried to brush it off. I walked back to the table, took a seat near the projector control panel, and started flipping through my slides. I wanted to check each animation, each data point, so I wouldn't embarrass myself the next morning. That's when I heard the soft squeaking sounds. I looked up. It was coming from the row of rolling chairs along the table. They were shifting ever so slightly. Each one moved maybe an inch or two. They all creaked, almost at the same time, like something nudged them. The sound made my stomach tighten. It was like a low groan from the metal and plastic. I tried to see if there was a draft strong enough to push the chairs, but I couldn't feel any breeze. They didn't keep moving. They just settled into a new position. My pulse sped up and I remember my hands starting to sweat. My chest felt tight. I pushed back my own chair and stood up. I looked at every chair carefully. There was no reason for them to move like that. They were spaced apart, not touching each other. None of them were on an incline. The floor was carpeted, so even a small breeze shouldn't have been able to shift them all. I found myself thinking about how quiet everything was. I heard the hum of the projector, the soft beep from my laptop, and the sound of my own breathing. I looked around for vents or open windows. Everything was closed and still. I felt that same chill on my skin. The hairs on my arms stood up. My heart pounded. My mind started racing with little thoughts. Get out of here. This isn't normal. You have work to finish, but do you really want to stay? I tried to calm down. I told myself it was mechanical, maybe some air pressure difference in the building. I pressed my palms onto the table and took a deep breath. I decided to keep going with my slides. I was determined not to let a weird incident derail my night. I sat back down, read through some text, clicked to the next slide. Each time I glanced up at the chairs, they looked the same. They didn't move again. After a few minutes, I felt a bit more relaxed. Then I heard a faint clack from somewhere behind me. I froze. I looked back, saw nothing. I turned around again, tried to refocus on my work. Another small tap. It sounded like a pen dropping on the floor. I stood up, walked around the table, checked every seat, looked under the table, inspected the floor. I didn't see any loose objects or anything that could cause that noise. I sat back down and tried to ignore it. My heart was still pounding, but I forced myself to continue. I clicked through 2 more slides. Then the next thing I noticed was the temperature dropping even lower. My skin felt cold, and I rubbed my hands together. I checked my phone to see if I had any messages. No signal problems, no texts, no calls. It was 1:10 a.m. The building's main lights were on sensors, so they had probably switched off in the corridors by now. That meant if I left, I'd be walking through a nearly dark hallway. I told myself that was ridiculous to fear. This was just a normal office, and I'd walked those hallways hundreds of times. I decided I'd finish quicker if I spoke through the slides out loud, as if I was rehearsing. I went through the introduction, read the bullet points, and timed myself. I was speaking in a low voice, just enough to hear how the script sounded. Everything felt more or less okay. Then I heard the chairs again. This time the squeaking was sudden, like someone pushed them harder. I jumped up so fast that my thigh hit the edge of the table. It was a dull pain, but it woke up all my senses. I put one hand on my leg and limped around the table, staring at the chairs. They were again shifted a little bit. The seats were no longer parallel to the table. It was subtle, maybe a few degrees off, but I was absolutely sure they had moved. I grabbed my laptop from the table, pulled the VGA cable, and slammed my notes shut. That was enough for me. I wasn't going to stay in that room any longer. I remember reaching for the light switch on the wall by the door. Then the overhead lights flickered. It wasn't the usual flicker you get in old buildings. This was a single flash. The bulbs went dark for less than a second and came right back on. My heart was pounding so hard I felt it in my throat. I nearly dropped my notepad. I rushed out, letting the door swing shut behind me. In the hallway, the temperature felt normal. I heard the gentle hum of the vending machine down the corridor. The overhead lights were faint, but enough to see my path back to my desk. I kept telling myself, that was weird, but maybe there's a logical explanation. My heart was still racing and my hands shook a bit. I walked to my desk and sat down, still feeling on edge. I considered calling a coworker, but it was past 1:30 in the morning. Nobody would be awake for that, and I'd sound crazy talking about moving chairs. I tried to calm myself by focusing on finishing the slides. I hooked up my laptop to a spare monitor at my workstation and continued editing. Every sound in that empty office made me jump. The creak of a chair in the distance, the hum of the elevator cables, the occasional beep from a printer. I checked the time again. It was nearly 2 a.m. The final version of my presentation was almost done, but I still needed that quick test in a meeting room to be sure everything would display correctly. Obviously, I wasn't going back to that same room. I decided to try a different meeting room 1 floor down. I told myself I'd do it fast. In and out. I packed up my stuff, took the elevator to the lower floor, and found another conference room. This one was bigger, had more chairs, but the projector was mounted on the ceiling, just like most of the rooms. It was warmer here, no sign of any chill. I walked to the light switch and flicked it on. The lights responded normally. I turned the projector on and connected my laptop. I flipped through the slides. Everything seemed fine. I felt a bit stupid for letting the other room scare me so much. Then I heard a faint knock behind me. My shoulders tensed. I spun around. The door was still closed. My eyes scanned the walls and corners. No one was there. I realized it might have been from the hallway or another room. It was quieter on this floor, so any small noise felt louder. I forced myself to get through the test. The slides looked correct. The transitions were smooth. I closed my laptop, turned off the projector, and left the room. I felt relief when I stepped back into the corridor. This floor had some overhead lights still on. Everything felt less oppressive than on the floor above. I told myself I'd had enough. I would finalize my slides at my desk and then get out of that building. Around 2:30 a.m., I shut down my computer, grabbed my keys and my bag, and headed to the elevator lobby. The place was dead silent except for the mechanical rumble of the elevator as it arrived. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor. I caught a glimpse of my face in the polished walls of the elevator. My eyes looked tired. My hair was a mess. I waited. The elevator moved down, passing each floor with a small ding. When I walked out into the lobby, the night guard gave me a curious look. He asked if I was the last one out. I said I thought so. I was tempted to mention the strange things I experienced upstairs, but I didn't. It felt pointless. He probably would have dismissed it or assumed I was exhausted. I said goodnight, and he buzzed me out into the parking garage. I drove home, replaying everything in my mind, but I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, maybe some weird building issues, maybe the chairs were on slightly uneven flooring. Still, when I got home, I had trouble sleeping. My chest felt tight, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw that moment when I felt the cold touch on my shoulder. My skin crawled just remembering it. The next morning, I arrived at the office early. I had a meeting in one of the bigger conference rooms with a few clients and my boss. The presentation went smoothly. Nobody mentioned any temperature issues or moving chairs. I didn't bring it up. After the meeting, I walked past the room where it happened. The door was open. 2 people from another department were in there chatting casually. The temperature inside felt normal from where I stood in the hallway. I left it alone. I don't really share this story with coworkers. I don't want to be labeled as the guy who sees ghosts or complains about weird stuff. But every time I walk past that room late in the evening, I get a knot in my stomach. I make sure never to stay too late unless I have no other choice. And when I do, I pick a meeting room that's near the windows or in a more central area of the floor. I can't explain everything I felt that night. The sudden chill, the cold touch, the movement of the chairs. But it happened. I know it did, and I still don't like walking into that room alone. When people hear me mention odd noises in the office at night, they usually roll their eyes or say it's just the air ducts. But I was there. I know what it felt like. That cold in the air wasn't normal. The chairs didn't roll around on their own because of a slight breeze. The touch on my shoulder was specific. It felt exactly like a cold finger. No matter how I try to rationalize it, I keep coming back to the same conclusion. Something I can't explain was in there with me. It didn't speak. It didn't show itself. But it made me feel more uneasy than I've ever felt in a building that's otherwise as ordinary as any other office tower downtown. I still work in the same place, and I haven't experienced anything quite that intense again. Sometimes I stay a little late, but I never stay past midnight anymore if I can help it. I keep reminding myself that I'm there for my job, not for ghost hunting or anything like that. But if someone ever told me they felt something off in those meeting rooms, I'd believe them. No questions asked. That's the full story. It's strange, unsettling, and I don't blame anyone for doubting it. But it happened, and I'm still not sure how to explain it. I had barely finished hauling in the last box when I heard it. It was a soft creak in the late afternoon, coming from above my head, almost like a shuffle. I stopped in the hallway, sweaty and tired from unpacking, and I tried to pinpoint the sound. It came from the ceiling. I stood there, heart pounding harder than I wanted to admit, until it stopped. That was the first day I realized there was an attic entrance in the hallway ceiling, a small hatch with a piece of rope hanging down. The landlord never mentioned it, and I had been too busy to notice. I brushed it off as the normal settling of an old house, but something about it bothered me. It sounded too much like footsteps. I moved into this house because the rent was reasonable and the location was convenient for my work. It's a single-story place with a sagging porch and creaky floors. The walls have chipped paint, and the windows rattle when the wind picks up. The landlord told me the house was old but sturdy. He looked me right in the eye and said, "Don't worry, the foundation is solid. You might hear a few creaks, but that's just the wood adjusting to temperature changes." During the first few days, I unpacked boxes, set up my furniture, and tried to make the place feel like home. I put a small television in the living room and a cheap bed frame in the lone bedroom. I cooked a few simple meals in the outdated kitchen, messing with the old gas stove that smelled faintly of burnt dust when I turned on the oven. Everything felt manageable, except for those noises in the late afternoon. Every day around 5 or 6, I heard a few slow, deliberate creaks overhead. I told myself it could be the house settling, but each time I sensed a pattern, like someone walking from one corner to the other. My neck tightened and my palms got sweaty whenever it happened. I tried turning up the volume on the TV, but my mind kept drifting back to the attic. A week after I moved in, I decided to check the attic. I couldn't ignore those sounds anymore. I had a day off, so I grabbed my small stepladder and carried it into the hallway. I pulled the string attached to the attic hatch and watched as it swung downward, revealing a set of rickety folding steps. A musty smell rushed out immediately, thick and damp. It reminded me of wet cardboard and old wood. I coughed and waved my hand in front of my face. I climbed the steps slowly, holding a flashlight in one hand and steadying myself with the other. The attic space was cramped with exposed beams and dark corners. My flashlight beam cut across dusty insulation and a few wooden boxes stacked near the far end. I could see cobwebs in the corners, thick with dust. The floor was made of uneven wooden planks, some looking warped from moisture. I stepped carefully, testing each plank with my foot before placing my full weight on it. I went straight for the boxes because they were the only noticeable objects in that space. They were old, made from a thick cardboard that had turned gray and soft at the edges. I opened one box and found faded photographs of an unknown family. I didn't recognize any of the people. Another box held some yellowed newspaper clippings, but they were damp and stuck together in places. I flipped through a few, but most of the print was smeared. I also found a small tin container with a broken lid. Inside were a handful of rusted keys, none of which looked familiar. Nothing jumped out at me as a direct cause for the sounds. There were no signs of large animals, no nests, no droppings. The attic wasn't very large, and I could see most of it just by standing in the middle and turning in a circle. The smell of mold was strong, and I felt my eyes itch. I rubbed them and decided I'd had enough. I walked back to the hatch, climbed down, and shut it. The smell lingered on my clothes, so I changed shirts and threw the old one in the laundry. That night, around 8 or 9, I heard the sounds again. They were louder than before. It started with a single creak, then another, then a few in a row. It sounded like someone pacing back and forth directly above the hallway. I jumped off the couch, turned off the TV, and stood there listening. My heart thudded against my chest, and I felt a jolt of cold sweat on my spine. When the pacing stopped, I waited to see if it would start again. Silence. I decided to give it a moment, but my nerves were shot. Each time I thought about climbing up there again, my stomach clenched. My nights became tense. I'd wake up at midnight to a faint groaning noise from above. I'd sit up in bed, heart hammering, and I'd stare at the ceiling. I'd try to stay still, barely breathing, to listen. Sometimes I heard nothing, sometimes I heard a thump. It was never so loud that it felt impossible to bear, but it was always just enough to raise the hairs on the back of my neck. It's hard to describe the feeling of lying there in the dark, waiting for the next creak. My mind wandered to all sorts of scenarios. Could a homeless person be living up there? Could an animal be making those sounds? But it never sounded like small scurrying. It always seemed heavier, slower. I called the landlord to ask if he knew anything about the attic. He sounded annoyed. He told me the attic was old, that he didn't keep anything valuable up there, and that the house made noises. I tried to explain that the steps sounded like actual footsteps, but he just told me to spray some pest control in case of rats or something. That was it. I hung up feeling frustrated and uneasy. The next evening, I heard the footsteps again around 6. I was in the kitchen washing a plate when the boards above me creaked. I turned off the faucet and listened. It sounded like someone took a few steps, paused, and then took a few more. I gulped. I walked into the hallway, stared at the attic hatch, and waited. The footsteps moved to the area above the living room, then stopped. I felt a wave of anxiety hit me. I needed to see what was going on. I grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar from my toolbox. My hands shook a little. I realized I was breathing too fast, so I tried to slow it down. I pulled the attic string and let the folding steps drop. The musty smell wafted down again. I climbed up quickly, crowbar in one hand, flashlight in the other, and tried to keep as quiet as possible. My pulse pounded in my ears. Once in the attic, I stood still, shining the flashlight around. The boxes were where I left them. The dusty beams were the same. The space was silent. I edged forward, stepping carefully on each plank. I felt the floor flex under my weight. The darkness swallowed the far corners, even with the flashlight. I inched toward the boxes and crouched down. There was nothing new, no sign of movement. I scanned every inch I could see, looking for footprints, smudges, anything. I found nothing fresh. No footprints other than the old smears of dust I had probably made myself. I stayed up there for about 10 minutes waiting. My legs started to ache from crouching, so I stood up. My breathing felt loud in that silent attic. Eventually, I heard a small groan from the wood under my feet, but nothing else. It was obvious that if there was something moving before, it wasn't moving now. I felt a chill roll over my skin, and I decided to leave. As the days passed, the sounds didn't go away. Late afternoon and late at night seemed to be the times when they were most common. I noticed something else that added to my anxiety. Sometimes when I was in the hallway, I felt like I was being watched, I'd stand there, and there would be this heavy feeling as though eyes were peering down through the tiny gaps in the attic floorboards. I'd quickly look up, but there was only the stained ceiling. One night I woke up at around 2 a.m. to the sound of a creak in my bedroom ceiling. My heart slammed into my chest so hard it hurt. I sat up, listening. The room was cold. I heard another creak, then a faint tap, like a knuckle on wood. My mouth went dry and I could feel adrenaline pumping through me. I got out of bed, grabbed the baseball bat I keep by the closet, and stood under the attic entry in the hallway. The hair on my arms stood up, and I could hear my own pulse. I waited, but the sound stopped. I stood there for at least 5 minutes, staring at the hatch, waiting to see if it would move. It didn't. The silence felt heavier than any noise. The next morning, I explored the exterior of the house. I walked around outside, checking for any hidden entrances or broken vents. The attic had 2 small vents on either side of the roof. I dragged a stepladder around the back of the house to get a closer look at them. They seemed intact, just old and covered in cobwebs. There was no obvious opening big enough for a person to slip through, at least not without breaking something. I didn't see signs of large animals either. No droppings, no tracks, nothing. I decided to talk to a neighbor, an older man who lived next door. We chatted over the fence. I asked if he knew anything about my attic or if anyone else had mentioned strange sounds. He shrugged and said he'd never been inside my house and that the previous tenants didn't stick around long. He didn't know why. That comment made my heart rate spike, but I tried to act casual. I asked if they had complained of noises. He just shook his head and said, "They never said much." Moved out pretty quick, though. House is old. It's bound to make noises. I thanked him and walked away, feeling uneasy. I wondered if people had left because of these sounds, or if there was another reason. Over the next few days, I tried to catch the noises on my phone's voice recorder. Every time I heard the footsteps, I'd grab my phone and press record. I wanted proof. But the recordings were faint. It mostly sounded like random creaks, not definitive footsteps. When I played the recordings back, they sounded ordinary, like any old house with expanding and contracting boards. I started to doubt myself, wondering if maybe I was imagining the pattern. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Sometimes I'd be brushing my teeth in the bathroom and I'd swear something was directly above me, listening. I'd look at my reflection, see the tense lines around my eyes, and realize how stressed I was getting. My sleep was restless. I'd jolt awake at the slightest noise. I began to dread coming home in the late afternoon because I knew, almost like clockwork, I'd hear those steps above. One Saturday evening, I mustered up the courage to do a more thorough search in the attic. I gathered a few items I thought might help: a strong flashlight, a small handheld camera to record, and a tape measure, in case I needed to check any odd spacing between boards. I climbed up once more. The smell of mold felt stronger. My nostrils stung and I sneezed. I moved the boxes aside and shined my flashlight on the beams, checking every corner I could reach. I measured the distance between the rafters, hoping to find any sign of tampering. Nothing seemed out of place, although I did notice some new scuff marks near the far edge, close to the attic's side vent. They looked like scratches on the wood, as if someone dragged something. But there was so much dust and old damage, it was hard to tell how recent it was. I spent nearly an hour up there, stepping carefully, scanning everything. I recorded video while talking quietly, narrating what I saw. My voice sounded nervous, even to my own ears. I finally crawled over to the side vent to check if it was loose. It was dirty and covered with spider webs. I nudged it a bit and it didn't move. As I leaned forward, I felt a sudden shift in the plank beneath me. It gave a loud creak and I froze, terrified I'd fall through the ceiling. I held still until the board settled. My heart pounded in my chest so hard it made me dizzy. The flashlight beam shook with my trembling hand. I inched my way back toward the hatch, deciding I'd done enough for the night. My nerves were shot, and I couldn't find anything definitive. Right before climbing down, I heard a faint noise behind me. It was a soft clack, like a small piece of wood hitting another plank. I spun around, shining the flashlight. Nothing moved. The boxes were where I left them. The rafters were empty. But my skin crawled and my breath came in short bursts. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in there with me, hiding just out of sight. I climbed down as fast as I could, shoved the hatch shut, and slid a heavy stool under it. In the following days, the noises didn't stop, but they also didn't escalate. They continued in the late afternoon and sometimes at night. I tried keeping track of them, noting the time and how many steps I heard. It usually lasted no more than a minute. It wasn't random. It almost felt routine. I felt trapped, uncertain if I should leave or keep investigating. The landlord brushed me off whenever I called. My job performance was slipping because I was so preoccupied and tired, yet I couldn't walk away from a lease I'd just signed. One evening, as I was unlocking my front door after work, I felt that sensation of eyes on me again. I looked toward the roof. Nothing. The house was dark, silent. I walked in, set my stuff down, and flicked on the living room light. Right on cue, around 6 o'clock, the footsteps started overhead. They paced from one end of the attic to the other. I stood in the hallway, staring at the hatch, listening to every board flex. My heart pounded, and my stomach tightened. The steps paused right above me. I held my breath. The wood creaked again. Then the sound faded toward the other side of the attic. Eventually, it stopped. That's where things are now. I'm living with this near-daily cycle of footsteps, that creeping mold smell, and the unsettling sensation that I'm never truly alone in this house. I don't have concrete evidence of anyone squatting up there. I haven't found a hidden door or any sign of forced entry. But I can't shake the certainty that there's something heavier than rats walking above my head. The regularity of those creaks isn't random. I hear them at set times, with a deliberate rhythm. I'm not sure what my next move is. I keep telling myself I'll call a professional to inspect the attic, but I haven't done it yet. Part of me worries they'll find nothing, and I'll look like a paranoid fool. Another part of me fears they'll actually find someone or something living up there, which might be worse. For now, I just live with the tension. Every day I come home and brace for that series of steps. Every night I wake up at the slightest noise, bat in hand, wondering if I should climb up those creaky steps again. That's my life in this old house. I don't know how long I can keep doing this, but for now, I'm still here, waiting for the next footstep overhead. I still remember the first morning I realized something felt off. Our group meets at the park every day before the sun rises. We jog together, chat about our lives, and push each other to get better. We're used to the dark, the cold, and the quiet streets. But that day I found footprints on the trail that didn't look like any of ours. They were smaller, almost delicate, and they showed up in patches where I wouldn't expect anyone to be. That's when I started paying closer attention. It was a small detail, but it lodged in my mind and wouldn't leave. My name is Carlos, and I'm a guy who likes routine. Every weekday I wake up at 4:30 a.m., have a glass of water, and drive to the park. The park itself is big and open, with a few lamps spaced around the main walkway. Off to the sides, there are some darker paths that cut through clusters of trees. Our group starts warming up near the entrance, where there's a parking lot and a small map on a board. It's usually me and about 4 or 5 others, depending on who can drag themselves out of bed. That morning, I felt fine. It was chilly, but nothing I couldn't handle. We started running together, just like we always do. The sky was still black, with a hint of dark blue on the horizon. We spaced ourselves out a bit on the path, falling into our usual paces. One of the guys, Marcus, took the lead, and I followed behind him by about 10 feet. We passed under a few lamps, and our shadows stretched out in front of us. The group's footsteps sounded steady. Everything seemed normal. Then I looked down and noticed a single footprint off to the right of the path. I glanced at my own shoe, then at Marcus's. The footprint on the ground was too small. It also pointed in an odd direction, angled toward the trees. I didn't stop. but I did slow down for a second to see if there was another print. I didn't catch anything else right away, so I picked up the pace again, focusing on my breathing. We finished our run, then did some cool-down stretches near the entrance. I asked Marcus if he saw any weird footprints. He just shrugged and said he was too focused on not tripping to notice. The others didn't see anything either. I let it go, figuring it might be some animal track or something else. Still, I kept thinking about how it had that human shape, like a bare foot or a running shoe. It just looked off. The next few days, I scanned the ground more carefully. Around the halfway point of our route, the lampposts are spaced farther apart. The trail dips a bit there, and there's a slight incline leading back up to the main loop. That's where I started spotting more of these odd footprints. Sometimes they looked clear, as if someone ran through a dusty patch. Other times I only saw a partial mark. Each time it caught me off guard. They didn't line up in a continuous path. They'd appear near the edge of the trail, disappear, then reappear a few meters later. I tried to mention it to the group again, but nobody seemed to care much. They were focused on their own workouts. A couple of them made jokes about ghosts or weirdos in the park. I tried to laugh it off, but I was curious. I decided I'd pay closer attention on my own. One morning I hung back on purpose. I told the others to go ahead, and I pretended to tie my shoe. When they ran off, I stayed quiet, looking around for any movement in the trees. The park was mostly silent except for distant cars and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I didn't see anything unusual, so after a minute I jogged to catch up. The next day, something else happened. As we ran along a darker section of the trail, I thought I saw a quick movement in my peripheral vision. It was dark, so I couldn't see the shape clearly, but I know I saw something. It looked like a silhouette darting between the trees, parallel to our path. I turned my head to get a better look, but it was gone. My heart pounded a little harder. My breathing got shallow. I almost stumbled because I was too busy looking for the figure. I glanced at Marcus, who was right in front of me, and he didn't seem to notice. I didn't say anything. I kept running, trying to shake off the weird feeling. That night, I couldn't sleep well. My mind kept replaying the sight of that shape. It moved fast, like someone running, but it didn't feel right. The park is usually empty at that time, except for a few of us who train. Even dog walkers rarely show up that early. I thought about animals, but it didn't look like an animal. It looked too upright, too human-like, but smaller somehow. The memory made me sweat, even though my room was cool. I checked the clock, 2 a.m. I had another 2.5 hours before I had to get up. I forced myself to relax, telling myself I was just seeing things. A few days later, I started feeling a growing tension before each run. I still went, but I was more alert. Every time we ran by the darker parts of the trail, I tried to catch sight of anything out of the ordinary. Several times I saw quick flashes of movement. Each time it felt like my heart jumped. My stomach tightened and the hairs on my arms stood up. I never saw a face. I only caught glimpses of a dark shape or something blending into the shadows. It always seemed to vanish as soon as I looked directly at it. I asked Marcus again if he ever felt like someone was watching us. He just shook his head and told me I needed more sleep. I tried asking the others too. They either gave me a confused look or laughed it off. The park is public, so maybe some other runner was just messing around, right? I tried to believe that explanation, but it still bothered me. Then one morning, I decided I'd do something different. I told myself I'd fake an injury or say I had to use the restroom. Something to get the group to go on without me, so I could stay behind and wait. I wanted to see if I could catch whoever was out there. Around the halfway mark, I slowed down, acting like my calf was cramping. Marcus and the others paused to check on me, but I insisted they keep going. They had their own pace to keep. I massaged my calf, breathing heavily. Once they turned a corner, I got up and stood behind a tree. I waited, listening. The sun wasn't up yet. The air was cool on my skin. My heartbeat thumped in my ears. I could hear my own breaths, slow and controlled. Then I picked up another sound. Quick, light steps on the grass. My eyes darted around, but I couldn't see much. The lamp a few yards away cast a dim glow, leaving everything else in shadow. I heard the steps again, a little closer. My chest tightened. I tried to stay calm, but my hands started shaking. Then I heard a faint, raspy breathing, like someone who'd just finished running hard. I felt a rush of adrenaline. My legs tensed up, ready to move if I had to. I backed up a bit, trying to merge with the trunk of the tree, but the bark felt rough against my shirt, and I probably made noise doing it. Suddenly there was a sharp rustle in the bushes. I tried to lean out just enough to see, but I couldn't make out a figure. The breathing stopped for a second, then started again, sounding almost frustrated or agitated. I felt a wave of cold sweat on my forehead. My mind raced with questions about who or what was out there. Maybe it was just another runner, but why hide? I inched forward, straining my eyes. The footsteps moved away, deeper into the tree line. I thought about following, but fear got the better of me. I didn't want to corner some stranger who might be dangerous. Instead, I waited a few more minutes, barely breathing, until I felt sure they were gone. Then I ran to catch up with my group. My legs felt heavy, and my heart kept thumping in my chest. When I got home that day, I could barely concentrate on anything else. My routine was ruined. I kept hearing that raspy breathing in my head. I kept picturing those footprints. That evening, I told myself I needed a better plan. Maybe I could bring a flashlight and look around more thoroughly. The park does have rules about the hours, but nobody really enforces them. If I got there slightly earlier, I might catch whoever was leaving those footprints. So a few days later, I arrived at the park around 4:15 a.m., a solid 15 minutes before anyone else. It was pitch black out. The lot was empty except for my car. I turned off the engine and sat there in silence for a moment, wondering if this was a dumb idea. My nerves were on edge, but curiosity pushed me forward. I grabbed my flashlight, got out, and started walking along the main path. My footsteps sounded loud against the gravel. The lamp posts were still on, but they felt dimmer than usual. I walked slowly, shining my light toward the edges of the path. A breeze rustled the leaves in the trees. Nothing seemed out of place at first, but I kept going, pausing every few steps to listen. Then I saw it, a clear set of footprints in the dirt near the edge of the trail. They were about half the size of my shoe print. They pointed toward the trees again. The pattern suggested someone stepping, then the prints vanished. I followed where they seemed to lead, shining my flashlight around. My hand shook a little, and I had to steady it so the beam wouldn't jump around. I saw some broken twigs and flattened grass. It looked like a narrow path going farther into the trees. I wasn't sure I wanted to go down that path. My gut told me it was risky to wander off alone. But I took a few steps off the main trail, just enough to see if the footprints continued. I only made it about 10 feet before I heard something, a quick movement through the brush. My stomach clenched. I swung the flashlight beam in that direction, but I saw nothing. Then I heard that same heavy breathing, the same one I'd heard before. My chest tightened. My heart pounded against my ribcage. I felt like I could bolt at any second. "Hello?" I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. I didn't hear any answer, just more rasping and a faint crunch of leaves. I hesitated a moment, then decided I wasn't about to chase someone down. I backed up slowly, keeping the flashlight pointed at the tree line. After I was back on the main path, I turned around and jogged toward the parking lot, throwing glances over my shoulder every few seconds. My arms felt tingly, and my breath came in short bursts. I waited near my car until the rest of the group arrived. I didn't tell them what happened. I just said I got there early to warm up. Part of me felt embarrassed. Another part felt terrified. We did our run as usual, but I couldn't focus. The entire time I kept expecting someone to jump out from the trees. I kept scanning the shadows, my heart racing. My mouth went dry every time we hit the darker sections of the trail. When we finished, I was drenched in sweat. The others thought I was just pushing myself hard, so they gave me encouraging pats on the back. For the next week, I tried to carry on as normal. I stopped sneaking around. I ran with the group and then I left. But every time I felt eyes on me when we hit the dark parts of the trail. Sometimes I'd hear a faint sound, like soft footsteps matching my pace on the other side of the trees. I never saw a face. I never saw a body. Just movement or a quick flicker of a shadow. My neck would get tense, and I'd feel my pulse in my temples. My breathing would go ragged. My mind kept flashing back to those footprints and that breathing. At one point, I considered calling the park authorities, but what would I say? Hey, there's someone running around making footprints and heavy breathing noises. It didn't sound like a solid complaint. The place is open to the public. People do all kinds of things there. But the odd pattern of footprints and the way those steps appeared and disappeared never felt natural. It felt deliberate. It felt like someone, or something, knew exactly how to move without being seen. I don't know who or what is out there. I only know that I still run with my group, but I stay near them now. I don't investigate. I don't lag behind anymore. There's a part of me that wants answers, but there's a bigger part of me that doesn't want to risk a confrontation. I don't hear many new stories from the others. They're not as observant, or maybe they just don't care. As for me, I keep my head down when we pass the darker areas. Sometimes I catch a blur out of the corner of my eye and I feel my muscles tense up like I'm about to fight or flee. My chest goes tight, and I grip my fists until my knuckles hurt. I have no evidence to show anyone. I haven't taken pictures. I haven't recorded anything. I only have my own memories of those footprints and that breathing in the dark. Sometimes I think about switching parks or changing my workout time, but I guess I'm stubborn. Or maybe I just can't accept that there's something out there that scares me. Even so, I'm not reckless enough to go looking for trouble alone anymore. So I keep running with my group. We meet at the same spot, we do the same route, and I try to ignore the uneasy feeling that settles in my gut whenever I pass that halfway point. Some days I get lucky, and I don't hear or see anything. Other days I spot those footprints again, or a shadow that moves too fast. It's never enough for anyone else to notice, but I see it, and I can't pretend I don't. I feel tense until the end of the run. Then I hurry back to my car, feeling my hands tremble as I open the door. That's the whole story. I still don't know what's really going on. There might be a harmless explanation. Maybe a stray dog with a weird gait, or a smaller runner who prefers staying hidden. But I can't shake the feeling that something's off. The footprints show up in random spots. The breathing sounds so close sometimes, right behind me. But when I turn around, nobody's there. Whatever it is, it's enough to keep me on edge. Enough to make every dawn run feel like I'm not quite alone, even when I'm with my friends. That's all I can tell you. It still happens sometimes, and I haven't figured it out. I run, I see strange prints, and I sense something in the trees. And until I decide to give up on that park, I guess that's how it'll stay. But believe me, once you start noticing footprints and shadows that don't belong, it's hard to ignore them again. It's a dark place at that hour, and who knows what really goes on before the sun comes up. I've seen enough to know that I'm not imagining things. It's there, and it's staying out of sight for a reason, and that reason is what I'm afraid to find out. I'm going to say this straight out. My first night noticing those flickering lights across the hall scared me more than anything I'd felt in a long time. I'm not a superstitious person. I'm not into ghost stories or anything like that. But something about an empty apartment with lights that keep blinking and a rattling doorknob at 1 a.m. gets under your skin. The strangest part is that it's all happening right in front of me, in a building I've lived in for years on a floor I thought I knew inside out. That's how this started, and I still don't have a good explanation for it. I live on the 10th floor of a residential building. My apartment is at the end of the hallway, so when I get off the elevator, I have to walk a decent stretch to reach my door. There's only one other unit on my side, directly across from me. According to the superintendent, that place has been vacant for months. I remember hearing it from him in passing. He said the owner was trying to sell it, but for some reason, nobody was biting. At first, I didn't care. An empty apartment meant no noise, right? That was fine with me. Then one night, maybe a few weeks back, I came home late from work. It was around midnight. I got off the elevator, and I noticed this quick flicker of yellowish light coming from under that apartment's door. I paused. I looked again. The hallway was otherwise dark, except for the standard overhead fixtures that never turn off. That flicker was obvious, though. It wasn't my imagination. It was like someone inside was flipping a lamp on and off. But I knew that place was unoccupied. Maybe someone was showing the apartment at night, or maybe a real estate agent forgot to switch off the electricity. Those were my first thoughts. It wasn't anything spooky at that moment. It was just odd. I stood there for a few seconds trying to see if I'd notice it again, but everything went dark. I shrugged and went inside my own apartment. Over the next few days, I saw that flicker again. It wasn't every night. Sometimes I'd come home, and the hallway would be normal. Other times, right when I walked past that door, I'd see a quick pulse of light under the threshold. It was almost always a faint yellow glow. It would last 1 or 2 seconds, then vanish. I remember thinking it might be some malfunctioning lamp or a short circuit. I'm not an electrician, but I've seen how some older fixtures can blink when they're on the fritz. The first time it really made me feel uneasy was a Friday night. I was getting home around 11 p.m. I stepped off the elevator, and I heard a faint clicking sound. It reminded me of how a lamp switch makes that little click when it's being toggled. I walked slowly, and I could tell the sound was coming from the vacant apartment. There was no other possible source. The hallway was silent. Each step I took felt heavier, like I was expecting something to jump out. Then I saw that same flash of light. It didn't look like a big lamp this time, more like someone flicking a lighter in a dark room. It went on, off, and then stayed off. I just stood there, feeling this cold wave wash over me. I went straight to my door, unlocked it, and got inside. My heart was beating hard. Once I locked up, I felt safer, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. It was probably a faulty wire, I told myself. Still, I left a message for the superintendent that night. I didn't call him on his cell, but I shot him a quick text asking if he knew about any wiring issues and wanted to. The empty place. He didn't reply right away. I went to bed with my thoughts swirling around. The following morning, he texted me back. He said something like, "Hey, thanks for the heads up. I'll check the circuit breakers and see if there's anything weird going on." That made sense to me. I tried to put it out of my head. Saturday was busy. Groceries, laundry, cleaning, all the usual. I got home later that evening, around 8 p.m., and the hallway was dark and still. No flickers. That seemed like a good sign. It was Sunday night when I first heard the doorknob rattle. I'd gone out to grab some takeout. By the time I came back, it was close to midnight. The corridor was dim, and everything looked normal. But as I passed the vacant apartment, I heard a metallic sound. It was like someone was twisting the knob back and forth, almost like they were trying to open the door from the inside. I felt all the hairs on my arms stand up. My first thought was that maybe the place wasn't so vacant after all. Could some squatters have gotten in? Could someone be using the apartment without the owner's knowledge? I didn't see any sign of forced entry on the door. It was a sturdy metal door, and it looked completely intact. I leaned in and listened. The rattling stopped. It was silent then. My heart was pounding. I glanced around to see if anyone else was around, but the hallway was empty. I stood there for a second or two, unsure of what to do. Then I convinced myself to just move on. I walked into my apartment, locked the door behind me, and tried to calm down. I barely slept. My mind wouldn't stop replaying that rattling noise. Over the next few days, I kept hearing that rattle whenever it got late. It was never during the day. It was always sometime between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. It would last for maybe 5 or 6 seconds, like someone jiggling a locked doorknob. Then it would stop. Sometimes I'd also catch that same flicker of yellowish light under the door. It wasn't bright enough to illuminate the hallway, but it was obvious if you were looking. I started telling myself I should probably let the superintendent know about the noise, not just the lights. But I hesitated. I didn't want to sound paranoid, and I wasn't completely sure if I was imagining part of it. Stress can do that to you, especially when you're alone late at night. One evening, though, I decided to record the hallway with my phone. I thought if I caught the flicker or the rattling on video, I could show it to the superintendent and have some proof. So around midnight, I snuck out into the hallway, turned on the camera, and kept the lights off on my phone to avoid being obvious. I stood there waiting. At first, nothing happened. It felt silly and embarrassing just standing around with my phone pointed at a closed door. I remember feeling a bead of sweat run down my temple. The hallway was quiet. The only thing I heard was the faint hum of the building's ventilation. Then the flicker started. It was that same quick flash, on and off, maybe half a second of light each time. My phone was capturing it. I felt a rush of adrenaline. Then I heard a click from behind the door. That's when the doorknob began to move. It jiggled 2 or 3 times. My heart was hammering. I whispered to myself, "Oh man, it's real." I was so startled that I almost dropped my phone. The rattling went on for maybe 4 seconds and then it stopped. No more light, just silence. I stood there, my phone still aimed at the door, feeling my pulse in my throat. After another minute or so, I hurried back to my apartment, locked myself in, and immediately played back the video. The flicker was there on the recording, clear enough to see. The rattling sound was faint but audible. I could feel my stomach twist. There was no doubt that something was happening in that place. I didn't have an explanation, but I had proof that it wasn't just in my head. The next morning, I went to show the super. He watched the video, frowned, and said he'd check the locks. He also mentioned he'd speak to the owner. He still believed it was probably an electrical short and maybe a loose lock mechanism, but I could tell he was uneasy too. For about a week, nothing happened. The hallway was quiet at night. No flickers, no rattling. I thought maybe the super fixed something. Then, late on a Thursday, I was getting home from a friend's place, and I saw the strobing light again. It was more intense this time, almost like someone was inside flipping a switch on and off. I stood there, probably looking like an idiot, just staring at the door. My pulse sped up. I took out my phone and started recording again. The flicker kept going for at least 10 seconds, then it stopped abruptly. A moment later, I heard a series of sharp clicks on the other side of the door, like something metallic snapping against the frame. I decided I had to knock. My logic was that maybe the owner was showing it to someone and forgot to mention it, or maybe there was an intruder in there. It might have been dangerous, but I was so on edge that I just wanted answers. So I knocked. 3 solid taps. My hand was trembling. No response. I waited a few seconds, then knocked again. Still nothing. I put my ear to the door and listened. It was silent. I tried the doorknob, just to see if it was locked. It was definitely locked. I gently turned it, but it wouldn't budge. I felt a slight resistance, like it was firmly secured. Then I heard something inside. It was the sound of footsteps, but very soft. I can't say how many steps, maybe 2 or 3. I backed away. My skin was crawling. That apartment was supposed to be empty. I rushed back to my unit. My hands were sweating so much that I nearly dropped my keys. Once inside, I threw the deadbolt, slid the chain in place, and tried to calm down. My breath was short and shaky. I paced around my living room. I didn't want to call the police for a weird noise. I figured maybe I'd phone the super in the morning. That night, I barely slept. Every tiny sound in the building made me jump. When I did talk to the superintendent the next day, he seemed annoyed and a bit confused. He said he'd just changed the lock the previous week to be sure nobody was breaking in. He also said the circuit breaker for that unit had been shut off since the last tenant left, which meant no power was running in there. That chilled me, because I'd seen the lights flicker with my own eyes. He insisted no electricity was flowing. I told him about the footsteps, and he looked at me like I was letting my imagination run wild. That weekend, I decided to do one more check, but I didn't want to do it alone. I asked my friend Gabe to come over. Gabe's the type of person who doesn't scare easily. I showed him the video, and he just said, "Yeah, that's weird." but there's got to be a normal explanation. So on Saturday night, around midnight, we stood out in the hallway together. I felt more confident having him there. We waited a while, maybe 15 or 20 minutes. Nothing at first. Then, sure enough, the light began to flicker, just a quick burst. Gabe looked at me, and I could see his expression change from skepticism to alarm. He whispered, "What the hell is that?" Then we both heard the doorknob jiggle. Gabe stepped forward and turned the knob. Locked. He knocked, asked if anyone was there, but no one answered. The flickering continued for a few more seconds, then stopped. Gabe turned to me and said, "Okay, that's messed up." We went back inside my place, and Gabe admitted he had no idea what we just witnessed. He agreed there was no natural reason for lights to blink when the electricity was supposed to be off, but neither of us had any desire to break in or do something illegal. We decided it would be best to let the super handle it. After that, the pattern kept repeating. Some nights it was just a single flicker. Other nights the door handle would rattle 2 or 3 times in the span of an hour. I started losing sleep because I kept thinking I'd hear it again. Sometimes I'd open my door and just look through the peephole. Nothing. Other times I'd hear the rattling first, go to check, and it would stop. It felt like living across from a locked room with someone inside who never wanted to come out or talk. Yet the super insisted the place was empty. Even the real estate agent swore nobody had been in there. The tension got so strong that I considered moving out. I even looked up a few rental listings online. But the thought of packing up my whole life over something I couldn't understand felt extreme. I decided maybe it would just stop one day, but it never really did. To this day, I still see those flickers under the door some nights. The rattling hasn't happened in a while, which is a relief, but I'm always on guard when I come home late. I walk faster down the hallway and I avoid looking at that door unless I hear something. I've gotten used to being on edge, which isn't how I like to live, but there's nothing else I can do. I wish I had a neat conclusion to this story. I wish I could say someone broke in and got caught, or that the wiring was fixed and everything went back to normal, but that hasn't happened. The super still says the apartment is vacant and it's listed for sale. Sometimes I'll see a real estate agent unlocking it during the day to show a potential buyer, but that's always in broad daylight. I've tried to peek inside and it looks like any other empty unit. Bare floor, blank walls, no furniture. It doesn't smell weird, and there's no sign of anything unusual. Yet at night those flickers come back. I can't predict them, and they still make me tense whenever I see them. I don't have a theory. I'm not telling anyone there's something supernatural going on. All I know is that I've never been so uneasy in my own home. Even Gabe won't joke about it anymore. He just changes the subject when I bring it up. I've stopped talking to most of my neighbors about it because they think I'm exaggerating or they think the super already handled it. The nights when it's quiet are almost worse, because I lie in bed wondering if I'll hear the doorknob rattle at 2 in the morning. That's the story of the empty apartment across the hall. It's still empty, at least as far as the official record shows. But every now and then, I see that glow under the door, and I can't ignore the fact that something, or someone, acts like they're inside. I've knocked several times and I've never gotten an answer. Yet I've heard movement. I've captured video of the lights and the rattling, so I know it's not just my imagination. The super can't explain it. The electrician says there shouldn't even be power running in there, and still the flickering continues. At this point, I just live with it. I've learned to expect it when I come home late. I keep my phone camera ready, just in case it happens and I want more proof. But there's not much else to do. It's not loud enough to call the police, and it's not dangerous enough to force an entry. The best I can do is try to ignore it, though it still sets me on edge. I've told a few friends, and they usually get creeped out. Nobody has a decent explanation. The logical part of me wants to chalk it up to faulty wiring, but I've never seen faulty wiring that tries to open a locked door. So yeah, it's strange, and it's real. I can't give you a neat wrap-up to this. I can only say that living across from that place has changed how I feel about long hallways and empty apartments. Every time I step off the elevator at night, I glance over at that door. Sometimes it's all dark. Other times I see that yellow glow and feel my heart skip a beat. And that's what's been going on here for months. I don't know if it'll ever stop. I just know I can't pretend it isn't happening. And for now, that's all there is to it.